The Simpsons has been on the air since the 17th of December 1989. In that time, it got a sitting president to attack it by name from a podium, caused a diplomatic incident with Brazil, sparked a national moral panic over a cartoon 10-year-old, and quietly generated more genuine academic analysis than almost any other show in television history. We are going through all of it tonight. Get comfortable. Springfield is waiting. Section 1. The Flanderization of Homer Simpson. Let's start with Homer, because Homer is where everything in this show begins and ends. Not the Homer you think you know. Not the Homer who stumbles through the door at 5:30 and falls asleep in front of the television with a beer balanced on his chest. That Homer is the finished product. That Homer is what 36 years of creative drift looks like when it finally settles into a shape the whole world recognizes. The Homer we are going to talk about is the Homer who existed before the show decided who he was. Because, for a very brief window, before Fox picked up the series, before the merchandise and the lunchboxes and the cultural phenomenon, Homer Simpson was a completely different kind of person. And the distance between what he was and what he became is one of the strangest transformations in the history of American television comedy. When the Simpson family first appeared as shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show in 1987, Homer was drawn and performed as something closer to a genuine threat. Not cartoonishly menacing, actually uncomfortable. When he yelled at Bart, there was no wink embedded in it. When he raised his hand, the show did not immediately cut away to a joke that neutralized the tension. The early Homer shorts have a texture to them that is genuinely unsettling to watch now. Not because they are poorly made, but because they are honest in a way that the later show very deliberately walked back. They look like a portrait of a real American household that is under real stress, and the stress is not being played for laughs, it is just being shown. Matt Groening has talked about this in interviews across the years. He designed the Simpson family as a deliberate rebuke to the family sitcoms that dominated American television in the 1980s. Shows like Family Ties and Growing Pains and The Cosby Show, which presented the American household as a place of warmth and reason and patient, lesson-delivering fathers. Groening wanted to draw the family that never appeared in those shows. The family where the father came home tired and irritable and did not always say the right thing. Where the kids were not charmingly precocious but actually kind of difficult to be around. Where love existed but coexisted with frustration and failure in proportions that felt real. That was the original vision. And then the show got picked up by Fox and things began to shift. Very slowly at first, then faster. Season by season, Homer changed. The genuine threat receded, the emotional complexity softened. The character who had started as a portrait of recognizable human failure began transforming into something that was funnier in a moment-to-moment sense, but structurally quite different from what Groening had originally imagined. The academic term that critics began reaching for is Flanderization, and it is one of the most delicious ironies in television history that the word itself was coined in reference to The Simpsons and named after one of the show's own characters. Flanderization is the process by which a complex character is gradually reduced to their single most recognizable trait, that trait being amplified season by season until it is the only thing the character is. Ned Flanders, the pious, endlessly cheerful neighbor, was the first example critics pointed to. But the real subject of the phenomenon was always Homer. In the early seasons, Homer's limitations were one part of a larger, more complicated portrait. He was not just dumb. He was proud. He was occasionally cruel in ways that the show acknowledged as genuinely cruel. He was capable of tenderness that felt earned. He was also capable of behavior that damaged the people around him in real and lasting ways. The show held these contradictions in tension with each other, and the tension was the source of the comedy. You laughed at Homer because you recognized him, because the gap between the man he thought he was and the man he actually was felt true. By season 8 or 9, the tension was largely gone. Homer's intelligence had been reduced to a level that no longer felt like exaggeration but like a separate species entirely. He did things that no human being could do while remaining recognizable as a human being. He ate a poisonous fish and survived. He was shot out of a cannon and walked away. He fell from the top of a waterfall and got up and kept moving. The physical comedy had escalated to a point where the character was no longer a flawed man, but an indestructible buffoon, and the emotional weight that had made the early Homer so compelling had been quietly evacuated to make room for more elaborate set pieces. The writers who worked on the show during this transition period have spoken about it with varying levels of candor. Some defend the evolution as a natural response to the demands of a long-running series. You cannot sustain the same emotional register for a decade. The audience wants novelty. The writers want new problems to solve. A more flexible, more cartoonishly absurd version of the character opens up story possibilities that a grounded version simply cannot access. Others are less comfortable with what happened. There is a conversation that runs through the fan community and through the academic literature on the show, a conversation about whether the creative choices that made Homer more broadly funny also made him less meaningful, whether the show traded something genuinely valuable for ratings and longevity, and whether that trade was worth it. But there is a layer beneath the Flanderization debate that gets at something more fundamental. When the show began, Homer's job at the nuclear power plant was not background detail. It was the center of the show's social commentary. Nuclear power had been the subject of intense public debate throughout the 1970s and 1980s. 3 Mile Island had happened in 1979. Chernobyl had happened in 1986, just 3 years before The Simpsons debuted. The image of a careless, intellectually limited man serving as the safety inspector at a nuclear facility was not just a comedy premise. It was a pointed piece of satire aimed directly at the gap between the seriousness of industrial risk and the casual incompetence with which American corporations manage that risk. The early episodes took Homer's job seriously as a source of meaning and of meaninglessness. There were episodes built around his shame about his career, his awareness that he had not become what he once imagined he would become. Those feelings gave the character a weight that is almost entirely absent from the later Homer, who has made peace with his mediocrity to the point where the mediocrity has become indistinguishable from contentment. Whether Homer's eventual acceptance of his own limitations is wisdom or defeat is a question the show raises periodically and then declines to fully answer. The episode where Homer's IQ is temporarily restored after the removal of a crayon from his brain is the most direct engagement with this question the series ever attempted. Smart Homer is genuinely impressive. He solves problems. He sees the world around him with clarity, and he is completely miserable. The world that Homer's intelligence reveals to him is not a world designed to reward people like Homer Simpson. The plant will never value him. Burns will never learn his name. The community will never give him the recognition that intelligence alone cannot manufacture in a town running on social inertia. So Homer chooses stupidity. He asks to have the crayon replaced. He chooses the fog. There are two ways to read that choice. The optimistic reading is that Homer is making a pragmatic decision about the relationship between intelligence and happiness, that he is recognizing something real about the limits of awareness in the absence of support structures, and choosing the version of himself that can actually function within the specific constraints of his specific life. The pessimistic reading is that the show is saying something deeply sad about the American working class, that the only way for a man like Homer to survive the system he is trapped in is to make himself incapable of fully understanding it, that the fog is not a comfort but a survival mechanism, that the choice Homer makes is not really a free choice at all, because a man who can see the cage clearly enough to be miserable but not clearly enough to escape it has not gained freedom. He has simply traded one kind of suffering for another. Whether that reading is fair is something reasonable people disagree about. But the fact that it is available, that the text of the show supports it as fully as any more optimistic interpretation, is part of what makes Homer Simpson one of the most argued about characters in television history. And there is one more layer to the Homer controversy that deserves space before we move on. This is the question of the strangling. Homer strangles Bart. This is a joke the show has made hundreds of times across its run. Homer's hands go around his son's neck. Bart's eyes bulge. Homer shakes him. The music plays. The audience laughs. It is one of the most recognizable images in the show's entire visual vocabulary. When the show began, the gag read as hyperbolic shorthand for parental frustration, clearly not meant literally. Exaggeration in service of emotional truth, the way cartoons have always operated. But as the culture shifted around the show, as conversations about domestic violence and child abuse became more nuanced and more present in public discourse, the strangling gag began generating a different kind of discomfort in at least a portion of the audience. Not a majority, but a real contingent who found, over time, that the casual repetition of the gag had accumulated into something that felt less like absurdist comedy and more like normalization. The show never addressed this directly, never stepped back from the gag or offered any kind of meta-commentary on it. The strangling continued through the 90s and the 2000s and into the present. And the debate about it continued too, mostly below the surface of mainstream conversation, but persistent enough to appear regularly in academic treatments of the show and in online discussions about where the lines of animated comedy actually fall. What makes that controversy specifically interesting is what it reveals about how Homer's character is constructed. The strangling is always framed as reactive, as a response to something Bart did. The structure of the gag positions Bart as the one who caused it. Homer is not presented as someone who initiates violence from a position of power or cruelty. He is presented as someone who snaps, who loses control, who responds to being pushed past his limit in a way that the show treats as understandable, if excessive. That framing is itself a kind of argument built into the joke's architecture. Homer is not a bad man. He is a limited man. He does not choose violence. He falls into it when his limited capacity for patience runs out. And Bart, by being Bart, is always the one who ran it out. Whether you find that framing reassuring or troubling probably says something about where you stand on a much larger set of questions about how television handles the complexity of people who are genuinely imperfect, but not genuinely evil. Homer Simpson has always lived in that territory. That is what makes him compelling. That is what makes him controversial. And that is what makes him, 36 years into his story, still the most argued about animated character in the history of the medium. He is what you get when you put a real, flawed, deeply human set of contradictions into a cartoon body and then run that cartoon for 3.5 decades. The contradictions do not resolve. They just accumulate. They get louder. They push against each other in new configurations as the culture around the show changes and the show does not quite change with it. Homer Simpson has been simultaneously the funniest man on television and the saddest. He has been a loving father and a negligent one, sometimes within the same scene. He has been America's ID and America's conscience and America's guilty laugh track all at once. The controversy is not a failure of the character. The controversy is the character. Homer Simpson is controversial because he is true. And the truth, in Springfield as everywhere else, has always been at least a little uncomfortable. Something worth thinking about as you drift off tonight. Next time you find yourself watching an episode, notice which Homer you are watching. The one who loves his family and knows it. Or the one who has been simplified for your entertainment. Both are real. Both are Homer. And the gap between them is the show's most honest confession about what it became over 36 years. Drop a comment down below. Tell me what time it is where you are right now and where in the world you're watching from. And if this is the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps. Now, let's keep going. Section 2. The Marge Problem. There is a version of The Simpsons in which Marge is the most interesting character in the family. It is a version the show visited regularly in its best seasons and then gradually drifted away from, not through any single decisive choice, but through the slow accumulation of smaller choices that, taken individually, each seemed reasonable, and taken together amounted to something the show never fully reckoned with. The Marge Problem, as critics have come to call it, is the question of what happens when a show built around honest portraiture decides over time that the character it has drawn most honestly is also the one it is least equipped to do justice to across 3.5 decades. Marge was not designed as the straight man to Homer's buffoonery. She was not simply the patient, long-suffering wife whose primary function was to react with weary exasperation to her husband's latest disaster. In the original conception of the show, she was a fully formed person with her own desires, her own frustrations, her own complicated relationship to the life she was living. A woman who had made choices that were real choices, not obviously wrong ones, but choices whose costs had not been fully visible when she made them, and whose costs became more visible as the years accumulated. The early episodes took that seriously. There are episodes from the first 4 or 5 seasons that stand as some of the finest characterizations of a particular kind of American woman in the history of television comedy. The episode in which Marge develops a gambling addiction is one of the show's quietest masterpieces, precisely because it refuses to make the problem either purely comedic or purely tragic. Marge's addiction is treated with the same non-judgmental intelligence that the show brought to Homer's alcoholism in other seasons. The show understood, in these moments, that vices are not character flaws in a moralistic sense. They are responses to genuine unmet needs. Marge gambles because the casino is the one place in her life where she is in control of her own experience, where the outcome depends on her choices rather than on everyone else's, where she can exist as a person rather than as a function. That is genuinely profound writing for a primetime animated comedy. It is not the writing of a show that sees Marge as a prop, but somewhere in the middle seasons, the show lost its grip on that version of her. Not suddenly, gradually. The center of gravity shifted more and more toward Homer's increasingly outlandish storylines, and Marge's role slowly shifted from co-protagonist to supporting character. From someone the show was genuinely curious about to someone the show needed to keep the household functioning so Homer could go somewhere and do something ridiculous. The most specific criticism leveled at the show's treatment of Marge is what critics call the reset button problem. The Simpsons, like all long-running episodic comedies, restores the status quo at the end of each episode so the next episode can begin fresh. This is a structural constraint of the form and is not itself a failure. But critics have noted that the reset is applied to Marge's individual storylines, with a particular thoroughness that sometimes borders on erasure. Marge becomes a painter and shows genuine talent. Reset. Marge joins the police force and demonstrates real competence. Reset. Marge opens a pretzel franchise. Reset. Marge goes back to school. Reset. Marge becomes a real estate agent. Reset. A playwright. Reset. Each of these episodes, individually, is often very good. Some of them are among the finest episodes in the series. The problem is not the episodes themselves. The problem is that, across the span of 36 seasons, the accumulation of all these resets tells a story the show almost certainly did not intend to tell. The story of a woman who repeatedly discovers new capacities in herself and is repeatedly returned to the domestic baseline before any of those discoveries can alter the fundamental shape of her life. Homer's resets work differently in terms of audience experience. Homer takes on a new obsession and returns to the power plant, but his return is always framed as a homecoming to where he belongs. The power plant is Homer's natural habitat. The comedy of his return is affectionate. The show does not ask you to mourn the Homer who nearly became a country singer or a chef, because those versions felt like departures from the real one. The Marge resets do not have that quality. When Marge returns to the domestic baseline, the show frames it with a pragmatic cheerfulness that can read either as mature acceptance or as quiet tragedy depending on what mood you are in when you watch. And the fact that it can read either way is part of the problem. The show never fully commits to a position on whether Marge's life is genuinely satisfying or genuinely limiting or some complex mixture of both. The refusal to commit is itself a choice with consequences. The most explicit engagement the show ever had with this tension came in an episode where Marge watches an old home video from early in her marriage and sees a version of herself who had plans, a list of things she intended to do with her life. The episode uses this footage to generate a gentle existential reckoning. Marge has not done those things. The life she intended is not the life she has. And the show treats this with genuine tenderness but ultimately resolves it in the direction of affirmation. The family she built is worth more than the plans she set aside, which is a lovely message, and probably true in the way that many lovely messages are true, as a real and valid perspective on a real and valid experience. But the controversy around that episode, and around the show's overall treatment of Marge, is that the affirmation feels like it is doing some work to foreclose the legitimacy of the question being raised. The question being, what if she could have had both? What if the specific sacrifices were not inevitable but contingent, the product of particular social arrangements she happened to be born into? The show does not quite want to ask that question with full force, because asking it seriously would require it to be critical of structures it prefers to treat as backdrop. The nuclear family, the suburban home, the gendered division of domestic labor, these are the environment in which the comedy lives. The comedy depends on treating them as fixed. Examining them too sharply would undermine the warmth that makes the satire of everything else bearable. This is where the Marge controversy becomes genuinely interesting as a piece of cultural analysis. Because The Simpsons has always positioned itself as a satirical show. It looked at American institutions with a skeptical eye. It skewered corporate power, organized religion, political corruption, educational dysfunction. It is a show with a genuine satirical conscience in all of those directions, but the domestic arrangements at the heart of the show have been largely exempt from that conscience. The specific ways in which domestic labor and emotional labor are distributed within the Simpson household, the specific ways in which Marge's life has been shaped by that distribution, these are things the show has never turned its full satirical attention toward. Some critics argue this exemption exists because the show needs to protect its own emotional core. The Simpson family has to remain fundamentally intact and lovable. Satirizing the household structure too sharply would undermine the warmth that makes everything else work. Others argue the exemption reveals something about the show's actual limits. That for all its willingness to challenge certain kinds of power, it has always been more comfortable with the familiar arrangements of gender and domesticity than it ever admitted to being. The Playboy controversy of 2009 is a specific incident worth pausing on. That year, Playboy published a photo spread featuring Marge Simpson, depicted in the magazine's characteristic style. The show's producers approved the feature. The response was genuinely divided. Some people found it amusing, a playful piece of cross-media silliness that was genuinely unusual and had some wit to it. Others found it troubling, arguing that it reduced the most complex woman in the Simpson household to a centerfold in a way that was inconsistent with the character's dignity as the show had otherwise constructed it. Groening's response at the time was broadly positive, framing it as a celebration of Marge. Not everyone agreed. And the debate that followed was, in condensed form, the same debate the show's overall treatment of Marge had been generating for years. Whether celebrating Marge means honoring her complexity, or whether there is a version of celebrating her that actually flattens that complexity into something more convenient. There is no clean resolution to the Marge problem because it is not a problem with any specific episode or specific creative decision. It is built into the show's fundamental structure. A structural tension between the kind of show The Simpsons set out to be and the kind of show it needed to become to run for 36 years without dismantling itself from the inside. A version of the show that fully honored the complexity the early episodes suggested about Marge's inner life would probably have been a darker show. A show willing to sit with the discomfort of a woman who loves her family and is also, sometimes, constrained by that family in ways that feel real and not purely comedic. A show willing to ask what it means to be the most emotionally capable person in your household and also the one whose capabilities are most consistently subordinated to the needs of others. That show would have been extraordinary, and it would probably not have run for 36 seasons in prime time. What we have instead is a show that visits Marge's complexity when the script calls for it, and retreats to her simplicity when narrative convenience demands it. A show that produced some of the most honest characterizations of a certain kind of American woman's experience, and then, over time, allowed those characterizations to become rarer. Marge Simpson is still one of the most recognizable women in the history of American television. Still, in her best moments, one of the most fully realized. But the problem is real, and it is worth knowing about as you watch the show. Worth noticing when the show is being generous with her and when it is being lazy. Worth asking whether the woman you are watching is the one the show believes in, or the one the show finds convenient. Section 3. The Bart Moral Panic. When The Simpsons first appeared on American television, Bart was the show. Not the family, not the satire, not Homer, Bart. He was the reason people watched, the reason they bought t-shirts, the reason Fox had a genuine cultural event on its hands. In 1990, Bart Simpson was everywhere. His face was on lunchboxes and backpacks and beach towels and bumper stickers. His catchphrases were repeated in schoolyards and offices and in conversations between adults who had never said anything like them before in their lives. Don't have a cow, man. Ay caramba, eat my shorts. These phrases entered the American vernacular with the ease that only truly viral culture achieves, which is to say, they stopped seeming like references to anything and started seeming like words that had always existed. And then the backlash came. Teachers complained. Parents complained. Church groups sent letters. Educational associations produced reports. A school district in California briefly banned Bart Simpson t-shirts on the grounds that they promoted disrespect for authority. William Bennett, who served as Secretary of Education, cited the show as a negative influence on children. Barbara Bush called it the dumbest thing she had ever seen. And then, in January 1992, the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, told the National Religious Broadcasters Convention that American families needed to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. It was a line in a prepared speech. It was delivered to an audience that appreciated it, and it became one of the most consequential television reviews in political history. Matt Groening's response arrived within days via billboards and press statements, written in character as the Simpson family. The Simpsons, the response noted, were also a family doing their best to get by in tough economic times. And in that they might have more in common with the Waltons than the president had intended to suggest. The Waltons navigated the Great Depression. The Simpsons were navigating a recession. The parallel was there if you wanted to see it. Bush's line elevated the show by treating it as significant enough to attack from a presidential podium. Politicians do not respond to things that do not matter. The show benefited from the attention enormously. Bush lost his re-election bid later that year. The Bart moral panic of 1990 and 1991 was, in retrospect, a fairly transparent piece of culture war positioning. Bart was a working-class kid who did not defer to authority, and the discomfort he generated in certain quarters was as much about class as it was about behavior. Middle-class anxieties about working-class irreverence have always expressed themselves through concerns about children, about the young modeling the wrong attitudes, about culture that does not reinforce the hierarchies that hierarchies prefer to have reinforced. The Bart Simpson controversy was a version of every previous moral panic about rock and roll and comic books and video games dressed up in new clothing. But there is a more interesting argument to separate from the moral panic noise, which is the argument about what Bart's early cultural prominence cost the show in the longer term. When the show first launched, the public image of The Simpsons was almost entirely synonymous with Bart. His face on the merchandise, his catchphrases on the bumper stickers, his particular brand of cheerful irreverence as the show's defining quality. This was commercially effective and creatively limiting at the same time, because the show the merchandise was advertising was not simply a vehicle for Bart's attitude. It was something considerably more sophisticated than that, and the public image created by the merchandise boom did not quite match what the show was actually doing. The person who arrived at The Simpsons expecting the pure anarchic comedy of the beach towel, Bart encountered something more complicated. A show that used Bart's irreverence as a surface, but was doing real emotional work underneath. A show interested in the family dynamics behind the pranks, in the specific sadness of a kid who performs irreverence partly as a defense against a world that has consistently told him he is not capable of more. The episodes from the early seasons that deal directly with Bart's inner life are among the most genuinely affecting things the show ever produced, and they are almost nothing like what the merchandising era suggested the show was. Bart on the Road, where Bart's growing maturity becomes quietly visible through a series of choices he makes when he has the freedom to make choices. Bart Gets an F, where Bart studies desperately to avoid being held back a year and still fails the test, and the moment when he weeps in the classroom is one of the most nakedly real moments the show ever allowed itself. The scene does not cut away. It does not diffuse the emotion with a joke. It stays with the weeping kid who tried and still came up short, and it treats that failure with the seriousness that failure in childhood actually deserves. You do not get those moments from the beach towel. The beach towel is only the surface. And the surface, amplified by the moral panic and the presidential commentary and the school bands, became the thing the show had to spend years escaping from. The relationship between Bart and Lisa is where the beach towel version of the show falls most completely apart, because the beach towel never had much to say about Lisa. She was present. She was drawn with specificity, but in 1990 she was not the face of anything. Bart was the face, Lisa was the depth. And the show needed both, but it only needed one to be famous. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. The show establishes this clearly and early and treats it seriously rather than using it as a quirky character detail. She is a genius in an environment that does not reward genius, which means her intelligence is simultaneously her greatest gift and the source of her most persistent suffering. She speaks up and gets ignored. She challenges authority and gets punished. She tries to improve the world around her and gets crushed by the weight of a community that has collectively decided it does not want to be improved. The contrast between how Bart's public profile operated and how Lisa's operated reflects something the show itself dramatizes constantly. The loud, performing, extroverted boy gets the cultural real estate. The thoughtful, earnest, inward girl gets the critical regard and the emotional resonance, and almost none of the visibility. In 1990, the show enacted exactly the dynamic it was quietly criticizing. And what happened over time is that the critical consensus gradually caught up to what the show had actually been doing all along. The episodes that appear on best of lists, the episodes that scholars write about, the episodes cited as evidence for the show's genuine artistic ambitions, these are disproportionately Lisa episodes. Lisa's Wedding, Lisa the Vegetarian, Lisa vs. Malibu Stacy. Bart Sells His Soul, which is technically a Bart episode, but which uses Lisa as the interpretive key to what the episode is really about. Bart Sells His Soul is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the most quietly extraordinary half hours the show ever produced. Bart sells his soul to Milhouse for $5 as a bet that souls do not exist. As the episode progresses, the absence of his soul begins to accumulate effects. He cannot laugh at things that used to make him laugh. He cannot feel things he used to feel. He is haunted by recurring dreams in which other children sail boats through a golden haze while he stands alone on the bank watching. The episode treats the soul not as a religious concept, but as an emotional one. The capacity for genuine feeling and connection that makes experience meaningful. And Lisa, who has been watching Bart throughout the episode with the specific clarity that comes from seeing someone more honestly than they can see themselves, eventually recovers his soul and gives it back. She does not make a speech about it. She does not explain herself. She just gives it back. And the moment is so quiet and so complete that it requires no elaboration. That episode is about the sibling relationship as a form of witness. Lisa sees Bart. She may not always like what she sees. She may be frustrated by him and exhausted by him and occasionally cruel to him in the way that siblings are cruel. But she sees him. And the being seen, the fact of being genuinely known by someone who has no particular incentive to see you favorably, is itself a form of grace that the show handles with real care. The moral panic around Bart was really a panic about the surface of the show. About the thing the merchandising presented to people who had not watched it, and the thing the bumper stickers announced, and the thing that made it easy for politicians to invoke it as a symbol of cultural decline. The surface was real. Bart was genuinely irreverent, and the show did genuinely celebrate a certain kind of cheerful disrespect for authority. But the show was doing something considerably more complicated underneath that surface. And the controversy around Bart was aimed at the surface while the real achievement was happening somewhere else entirely, in the episodes that the people writing those letters were never going to watch. Section 4. The Writers' Room Wars. The most important room in the history of The Simpsons is one you have never seen. It exists in Los Angeles, and over the decades it has contained some of the most talented comic writers in the history of American television. It has also contained some of the most bitter creative conflicts, some of the most significant departures, and some of the most consequential decisions about what this show would be and who would get to take credit for making it. The writer's room is where The Simpsons was actually built. Not in Matt Groening's head, though he provided the initial vision. Not in the animation studios. In the room where writers sat around a table and argued about jokes and characters and what kind of show they were actually making. And the story of that room is the story of the show in ways that most viewers have never fully understood. The controversy that shadows the entire creative origin of the series centers on a man named Sam Simon. Simon was brought onto the show very early in its development as the third part of what was effectively a founding creative team alongside Groening and James L. Brooks. His contribution to what the show became is one of the most debated questions in its history, not because there is genuine uncertainty about what he did, but because the credit for what he did was distributed in ways that many people who worked on the show found deeply unfair. Simon essentially built the writer's room. He hired many of the writers who gave the show its voice in the early seasons. He developed the characters from Groening's original sketches into fully realized people with consistent psychology and behavioral logic. He established the tone of the show as something more than an animated sketch, as a piece of writing that took its characters seriously even while mining them for comedy. The early Simpsons had a quality of emotional intelligence that was unusual for animation, and that quality came substantially from the writer's room Simon assembled and led. In 1993, after 4 seasons, Simon left the show. The circumstances of his departure have been described in various ways by various people, and the versions do not always agree. What is agreed upon is that the relationships between Simon and Groening and Brooks had become sufficiently strained that continued collaboration was impossible. Simon retained his executive producer credit and continued receiving residuals for the rest of his life, which, given the show's longevity, amounted to an extraordinary sum. He used much of that wealth for animal welfare causes. He died in 2015. The tributes from former colleagues were warm. The tributes from the show's official channels were considerably cooler. The Sam Simon controversy is ultimately about how credit works in collaborative creative endeavors and how the specific ways credit gets distributed in Hollywood's hierarchical structure can erase the contributions of people whose work was foundational without being sufficiently famous. Groening became the face of the show because Groening created the family and Groening's name was on the title card. Brooks became the institutional guardian of the show's reputation because of his enormous standing in the industry. Simon became a contested figure in the show's history, present in every episode you watch and absent from most of the conversations about what made those episodes great. The writers who followed Simon and built the show's peak seasons are themselves a remarkable cohort. The writers' room during what fans call the Golden Era, roughly seasons 3 through 8, contained one of the most extraordinary concentrations of comic writing talent in the history of American television. Conan O'Brien was there before he left to take over late night. He brought to the show a kind of absurdist formalism, a willingness to follow a comic premise to its most extreme logical conclusion without worrying about whether the conclusion was comfortable. Several of the episodes most widely regarded as the show's finest were written by O'Brien, including Marge vs. The Monorail, which remains one of the most formally perfect episodes of comedy ever produced for American television. A con man arrives. He sells a town on a monorail it does not need. He does it through a song. The song works as musical parody and as character study and as genuine satire of American civic vanity all at the same time. O'Brien wrote that. He was in his 20s. It is one of the greatest things any writer has ever done for the medium. George Meyer was there. Among the writers who worked on the show, Meyer is spoken of with a reverence that approaches mythology. He is widely regarded by his peers as the funniest writer who has ever worked in American television, and the people saying this are themselves extremely funny writers. His specific gift was for jokes that were simultaneously absurd and precise, that operated at the limit of what comedy could contain without becoming something else entirely. John Swartzwelder was there, an eccentric genius who wrote more episodes of the show than any other individual writer, and who operated with a creative autonomy that was unusual even within a room that gave its writers considerable freedom. He eventually left Los Angeles and was rumored to write his scripts from a booth in a diner that he had purchased and installed in his home so that California's smoking restrictions would not apply to him. Whether that story is entirely true or partly mythologized, it captures something real about the specific creative energy of that era. The transition away from this era and toward the showrunner regime that took over in the late 90s is one of the show's most significant internal controversies. The Oakley and Weinstein tenure, seasons 7 and 8, is almost universally regarded as the creative peak. What followed, under Mike Scully, is almost equally regarded as the period when the show's foundational qualities began to erode. Something shifted in the show's sensibility during those years. The show became more willing to sacrifice character consistency for immediate joke payoffs. More interested in spectacle than in story. Episodes that would once have been grounded in emotional reality drifted toward pure silliness. Homer's character suffered the most visible damage, becoming less a person and more a delivery mechanism for physical comedy. Scully has responded to this criticism in interviews with varying degrees of defensiveness and candor. His broad position is that any showrunner inheriting those seasons would have faced the same challenges of freshness and continuity. The show had been running for nearly a decade. The low-hanging fruit of character and situation had largely been harvested. Finding new stories to tell with the same characters without repeating yourself or damaging what had been built was genuinely enormous as a creative challenge. This is partially true, but it does not fully account for the specific ways the show changed. The specific gradations of character that began to flatten, the specific kinds of stories that began appearing, and the specific kinds that stopped appearing. There is something real in the critique, even if the pressures that produced it were structural as much as personal. The Harry Shearer episode is the most recent and in some ways the most dramatic of the show's significant internal crises. Shearer voices an enormous number of the show's characters, among them Burns, Smithers, Skinner, Ned Flanders, Kent Brockman, and several dozen others. In terms of sheer vocal range and the number of characters he has built from nothing, he is arguably the most valuable performer in the ensemble. In 2015, Shearer announced he was leaving. His public statements pointed to contractual disagreements, specifically frustration about restrictions on his ability to work on outside projects. The response from the show's producers was chilly. There was a period during which a continuation without Shearer seemed genuinely possible, requiring the recasting of every character he voiced. That did not happen. Shearer eventually returned. The specific terms of his return were never made public. But the episode, which played out over several months in entertainment press and on social media, was a reminder of how dependent the show had become on specific voices and characterizations developed over decades, and how fragile that dependency could turn out to be. The salary controversies of the early 2000s generated their own cultural moment. The 6 main cast members negotiated a deal that paid each of them approximately $8 million per season. The numbers were large enough to become news in themselves, and the story carried with it a particular American fascination with the spectacle of famous people becoming extraordinarily wealthy in real time. The controversy around those negotiations was partly about the numbers and partly about a broader question of how creative compensation works in a collaborative industry. The writers who had built the show's creative foundations were not receiving $8 million per season. Many of them had moved on years earlier. The voice actors, whose work was essential to the show but whose relationship to its written content was performed rather than originated, received compensation that dwarfed anything the writers saw. This is not a simple injustice narrative. The voice actors' contributions are genuine and substantial. Dan Castellaneta is not simply a delivery mechanism for Homer Simpson. His specific choices, his timing, his emotional range in any given performance contribute meaningfully to the character. The same is true for every member of the main cast. But the disparity in financial compensation between the people who write the show and the people who voice it is significant, and the salary controversy brought that disparity into unusual public visibility for the first time. The writers' room wars, taken as a whole, paint a picture of an institution that has managed its creative conflicts with varying success over 36 years. That has cycled through different creative visions. That has made decisions under commercial pressure that were not always the best creative decisions, and that has somehow managed to survive all of it. What the history of that room ultimately suggests is that the show was never a single person's vision made real. It was always a collective enterprise, always the product of negotiation and conflict, and the specific chemistry of specific people working together at a specific moment. The golden era happened because the right people were in the room at the right time. The decline happened because time moved on and people left, and the room changed. That is the story of every creative institution that has ever tried to sustain itself beyond its original moment. The miracle is not that the show eventually declined. The miracle is that it ever produced what it produced at all. Those heights required too many coincidences, too many specific human gifts arriving in the same place at the same time to be anything other than extraordinary. Extraordinary things do not last. That is part of what makes them extraordinary. Section 5. The guest star economy. The Simpsons did not invent the celebrity cameo. Television had been featuring famous faces in guest roles since the medium found its footing. But the show refined the celebrity cameo into something more complicated than what it had been before. Something that operated simultaneously as comedy, as cultural commentary, and as a peculiar kind of transaction in which fame was both the commodity and the subject being examined. The show's approach to guests evolved in distinct phases across its history. Understanding those phases is useful for understanding one of the show's most persistent, low-grade controversies. At what point does a celebrity appearance stop being a creative choice and become a booking exercise? In the early seasons, guest appearances were almost uniformly played against type. The show did not bring famous people in to play themselves in flattering ways. It brought them in to play themselves in ways that were frequently unflattering, occasionally absurd, and consistently interesting because the absurdity was the point. The show used celebrity recognition as a mechanism for defamiliarization. for making you see familiar cultural figures in ways that disrupted the usual relationship between famous person and adoring audience. The most extraordinary example of this, and one of the most discussed guest appearances in the show's history, involved Michael Jackson. Jackson appeared in the second season playing a large white man named Leon Kompowski, who believed he was Michael Jackson and was living in a mental institution. The voice in the episode was Jackson's own. The credit on the episode read John J. Smith. Jackson had specifically requested anonymity, and the show honored that request. For years, the episode aired with that credit, and the producers neither confirmed nor denied that the voice belonged to him. This arrangement was unusual in itself. A global superstar appearing on a major television show and asking not to be credited, but it produced something genuinely interesting. A guest appearance that complicated the relationship between celebrity and character in ways that a straightforwardly credited appearance would not have. If you knew it was Jackson, the episode worked one way. If you did not know, it worked differently. The ambiguity was built into the premise. Jackson also contributed original music to the episode, specifically the birthday song he sings for Lisa. That song is genuinely touching, and the willingness of the show to let a guest star contribute original material and integrate it into the story rather than treating it as a showcase moment was characteristic of the early guest star approach. Guests were being used as creative resources rather than as promotional opportunities. Dustin Hoffman appeared in Season 2 under a pseudonym as well, voicing a substitute teacher who forms a meaningful connection with Lisa. The episode is one of the show's most beloved, and the quality of the guest performance is inseparable from the quality of the surrounding story. Hoffman brought to the role the kind of genuine craft that most actors in that situation would not have considered necessary for an animated guest spot. Paul McCartney appeared in the episode Lisa the Vegetarian, which followed Lisa's decision to stop eating meat after bonding with a lamb at a petting zoo. McCartney's condition for participating was that the show had to permanently commit to never reversing Lisa's vegetarianism. She had to remain a vegetarian in perpetuity, or he would not do it. The show agreed. Lisa has been a vegetarian in every episode since. That condition is one of the most charming creative stipulations ever attached to a celebrity appearance, and the fact that the show honored it across decades afterward says something about its relationship to character consistency in at least this specific instance. The Cypress Hill episode is a beloved example of the early approach executed with perfect absurdist commitment. Through a series of escalating miscommunications too elaborate to summarize adequately, the London Symphony Orchestra accidentally gets booked to perform at the same festival as Cypress Hill. Through another series of events equally impossible to summarize, Cypress Hill ends up performing with the symphony. The premise is committed to with absolute seriousness by everyone involved, and the result is one of the show's great moments of pure comic escalation. And then in 2024, 28 years after the episode aired, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall, turning the joke retroactively into a prophecy, which is the most charming kind of prophecy there is. What happened in the mid to late seasons was a gradual shift in the function of celebrity appearances. The show began booking guests who were appearing primarily as themselves, playing recognizable versions of their public personas rather than being used as raw material for character work. The satirical edge that the early guest appearances had, the willingness to make famous people look complicated or human in unexpected ways, began to dull. Celebrities showed up in Springfield, and the show treated them with increasing deference. This shift is connected to the broader changes in the show's sensibility in the Scully era and beyond. As the show became less confident in its satirical ambitions, its use of celebrity changed to match. Where early episodes used guest stars to destabilize the audience's relationship to fame itself, later episodes used them to generate the particular excitement of recognition, the pleasure of seeing someone famous in an unexpected context. That pleasure is real. It is not nothing, but it is a lesser creative achievement than what the show had been doing earlier, and the critics who noticed the change were pointing at something genuine. The celebrity cameo went from being a creative tool to being a promotional one. The Michael Jackson episode has its own late controversy that is difficult to avoid. In 2019, following the release of Leaving Neverland, the documentary featuring allegations of child sexual abuse against Jackson, the show's producers made the decision to pull the episode from circulation. It is no longer available on Disney Plus or in broadcast reruns. The decision generated significant debate. Those who supported it argued that continuing to air an episode featuring Jackson's voice, in any form, was inconsistent with taking the allegations seriously. Those who opposed it argued that the episode itself, as a piece of creative work, was entirely separate from Jackson's personal conduct, that it involved no children, that it was in fact one of the most genuinely affecting half hours the show ever produced, and that pulling it from availability was a form of cultural erasure that resolved nothing while removing something of real value. The debate about whether artistic work can or should be separated from the personal conduct of its contributors is not one that The Simpsons invented, and the show's decision is not a final word on it. It is one instance of a much larger ongoing argument about how culture handles the legacies of people whose work and whose actions are in significant tension with each other. The show's producers made the choice they made in the cultural moment they found themselves in, which is all anyone can do, and the conversation around that choice is still ongoing. Section 6. The episodes that caused international incidents. There are episodes of The Simpsons that generated consequences far beyond the usual lifespan of a television controversy. Most episode controversies last a news cycle. They are written about, discussed, and forgotten. But a handful of episodes in the show's history created diplomatic incidents, legal threats, and political crises that lasted years. These are worth knowing about, not just as episodes, but as events. The Brazil episode is where to start, because it is the most striking example of an animated half-hour creating an actual international diplomatic situation. The episode Blame It on Lisa, which aired in 2002, sends the Simpson family to Rio de Janeiro. Homer and his family travel to Brazil after discovering that Homer has been sending money to a Brazilian orphan through a charity. What follows is 30 minutes of fairly standard Simpsons comedy, in which Rio de Janeiro is depicted as a city of kidnappings, dangerous wildlife, rampant street crime, and carnival chaos. The response from Brazil was extraordinary. The Brazilian government released an official statement condemning the episode. The Brazilian Tourism Ministry threatened a boycott of Fox. Politicians made speeches. The state of Rio de Janeiro's tourism authority considered legal action. The mayor of Rio was publicly outraged. Brazilian media covered the controversy for weeks. Fox's response was what was widely characterized as a non-apology apology. A spokesperson said the show had portrayed Rio with affection and that any perceived slight was unintentional. This did not exactly address the specific complaint, which was that the episode had depicted Rio as essentially lawless and dangerous in ways that bore little relationship to the actual experience of the city. The episode's writers were publicly unapologetic. They argued that the show satirizes American cities with equal irreverence, and that holding foreign settings to a different standard was its own kind of soft bigotry. This argument has some merit as a defense of satirical consistency, but it does not quite address the specific ways the Brazil episode's portrayal felt different from the show's treatment of American locations. The difference being, roughly, that the show's American satire was rooted in specific cultural observation and familiarity, while its treatment of Brazil relied more heavily on general stereotype. The controversy did not go away quickly. Brazilian tourism was not measurably affected by the episode, but the diplomatic and political response to a cartoon was significant enough to feature in actual diplomatic briefings, which is a remarkable thing for an animated show to have achieved. The September 11 situation was of a completely different character. The show's production schedule meant that in September 2001, there were completed episodes waiting to air that contained imagery that suddenly felt deeply inappropriate in the aftermath of the attacks. Several episodes were pulled from their scheduled broadcast slots. This was not unusual. Many television programs made similar decisions in the weeks that followed. But the specific episodes the show chose to pull or delay, and the decisions about when and whether to return them to broadcast, generated ongoing discussion among fans who cared about the show's relationship to the specific cultural moment it was living through. More interesting than the immediate response was the longer-term question of how the show would address September 11 in its ongoing storytelling. The answer was broadly that it mostly did not. The show's floating timeline and its commitment to a kind of permanent present meant that it did not have to directly address what had happened to the country in the way that more realist dramas were obligated to. Springfield existed in its own temporal bubble. The events of the outside world entered the show only when the show chose to admit them. Critics and fans had different responses to this choice. Some argued that the show's refusal to directly engage with the defining event of the early 2000s was a failure of nerve, that a show with the cultural standing and satirical ambitions of The Simpsons had a specific obligation to grapple with what had happened. Others argued that the show's commitment to its own internal reality was precisely what made it valuable, that a show set in a town called Springfield was not well equipped to address mass tragedy in ways that would be either honest or useful. The Principal and the Pauper episode deserves extended attention here, because it is the episode that generated the most sustained internal controversy in the show's history. The episode, which aired in Season 9, revealed that the character the audience had known as Principal Skinner for 8 seasons was actually an imposter named Armin Tamzarian. The real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam veteran, was still alive and returned to Springfield to reclaim his identity. The fan response was immediately and overwhelmingly negative, and has remained so for more than 25 years. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, publicly criticized the episode. Critics argued it retroactively destroyed the character by revealing that everything the audience knew about him was built on a lie. His military service, his relationship with his mother Agnes, his dynamic with Bart, his specific psychology, all of it, the history of a character built across 8 seasons, constructed on a fiction. The show's response was wrapped in meta-humor. A judge issued a legal decree, making it illegal to ever mention the truth again, under penalty of torture. The real Skinner was tied to a train and physically expelled from Springfield. The show was clearly acknowledging that it knew exactly what it had done. But the acknowledgement was so casual, so committed to treating the problem as a joke, that it did not feel like genuine engagement with what had been broken. Al Jean has since described the episode as one of the show's creative mistakes. That is an unusually candid admission for a senior creative figure on a long-running show. The episode remains in the canon. It continues to create structural difficulties for any subsequent episode that tries to engage seriously with Skinner as a character. What makes that episode genuinely interesting beyond the controversy is what it accidentally reveals about how Springfield operates. The town votes to maintain the lie. They choose the comfortable fiction over the uncomfortable truth. They expel the real Skinner, the man with actual evidence of what actually happened, and they make it a crime to acknowledge him. That is not a comedy beat. That is a show telling you something true about how communities survive by choosing which truths to enforce and which to outlaw. Whether the episode intended that reading or stumbled into it on the way to the reset button is a question worth sitting with. Section 7. The real Springfield problem. There is a town in Vermont called Springfield. There is also one in Illinois, and in Missouri, and in Ohio, and in Massachusetts. There are, depending on how you count, more than 30 Springfields in the United States. Matt Groening chose the name specifically because it was the most common city name in America. The name that could belong anywhere and therefore belonged everywhere. But the question of which Springfield was the real Springfield became, over the course of the show's first decade, one of the most sustained and genuinely charming competitive cultural arguments in American history. Towns across the country made their cases. Local newspapers wrote editorials. Mayors sent letters. Historical societies produced evidence. The argument was mostly good-natured, and it generated an astonishing amount of local journalism, given that it was fundamentally an argument about the location of a fictional town in a cartoon. The contest reached its most formal expression in 2012, when Springfield, Vermont, won a competition run by the producers in which competing Springfields submitted cases for why their town should host the premiere of the Simpsons movie. Vermont won, and the premiere was held there with considerable ceremony and local celebration. The town briefly became the most famous Springfield in America, and local businesses made the most of it in ways ranging from charming to aggressively commercial. That same year, Matt Groening gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine in which he acknowledged that he had named the town after Springfield, Oregon. He grew up near it. He chose the name because it was one of the most common in America, and because the childhood association was there. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery was solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Case closed. And then the show immediately continued contradicting this revelation. Episodes aired after the interview that placed Springfield in geographic contexts completely inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's confession. They kept the mystery alive because the mystery was the point. And the point had always been the point. Springfield's unlocatable quality was not an accident of production. It was a deliberate creative principle maintained across 36 years. Springfield has oceanfront property in some episodes, mountain ranges in others, desert in others. Active volcanoes have appeared within driving distance. It has bordered Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky in different episodes. It has weather ranging from blizzards to tropical heat waves within the span of a single season. Lisa's area code is 636, which is a Missouri code. The state abbreviation has been shown as NT, which is not a real state. When Homer calls the state capital, the voice on the other end identifies the state as beginning with a vowel, which narrows the field by eliminating roughly half the states while keeping dozens of others viable. Every clue that appears to narrow the possibilities is followed by another clue that contradicts it. The show has been doing this for 3.5 decades, with what can only be described as malicious cartographic glee. The promotional dimensions of the Springfield debate have continued into the present. Various cities use their potential claim to the Springfield identity as a tourism hook. Springfield, Illinois has Simpsons-related attractions, despite the show having never canonically confirmed an Illinois connection. Springfield, Ohio has made similar investments. The commercial value of the association is real enough to motivate genuine expenditure, which is itself a testament to the show's cultural reach. The most interesting dimension of the geographic ambiguity is not the trivia of it, but what it means structurally. Springfield cannot be located, not because the show cannot decide, because the show decided decades ago that Springfield is more valuable as a mystery than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone. The person watching in Alabama recognizes it. The person watching in Oregon recognizes it. The person watching in Vermont recognizes it. And they all recognize different things, different specific textures of their own experience of American life, reflected back at them from a town that has just enough specificity to feel real and just enough universality to feel like home. You cannot do that if Springfield is definitively in one state. You can only do it if Springfield is everywhere, which is where it is and always has been. Section 8. The Religion Wars of Springfield. The Simpsons has a more sustained and more thoughtful relationship with organized religion than almost any other piece of American popular entertainment, which surprises people who have not thought carefully about it. Once you start looking for the religious dimension of the show, you find it everywhere. In the structure of individual episodes, in the characterization of recurring figures, in the show's treatment of the supernatural, in its specific rendering of the First Church of Springfield and the people who populate it, the show's religious controversies have come from both directions. From people who found the treatment of religion too disrespectful, and from people who found it not critical enough. The fact that it generated significant objections from both sides is itself evidence of something interesting. The show took a genuinely complicated position on faith rather than a simple one in either direction. Ned Flanders is the natural starting point because Ned is the show's most sustained engagement with the figure of the sincere Christian believer. Ned is devout. He is not depicted as devout in a satirical or hypocritical way. He genuinely believes. He genuinely tries to live according to his beliefs. He is kind, patient, generous, and forgiving in ways that the show depicts as arising from a real spiritual commitment rather than from social performance. And the show treats him with genuine respect, which surprised many viewers when they stopped and thought about it carefully. The Simpsons, a satirical show that takes on every form of American institutional failure with evident relish, chose to portray its most prominent believer as a person the show clearly liked. The distinction between Ned's personal faith and the faith of the organized church the characters attend is one of the show's most careful and consistent theological observations. The church itself, under Reverend Lovejoy's leadership, is treated with considerable irony. Lovejoy is a man who chose his profession out of genuine calling, but has been ground down by decades of ministry into a kind of professional religiosity that has almost nothing to do with the faith that presumably brought him to the work. He goes through the motions. He delivers sermons designed to avoid offense rather than to challenge. He manages the institutional church with the weary pragmatism of someone who long ago stopped asking what it was all supposed to mean. The distinction the show draws between Ned's personal faith and the institutional religion he practices within is a sophisticated theological observation that goes considerably beyond the usual satirical treatment of organized religion. The show is not saying that religion is bad. It is saying that institutions tend to attenuate the genuine thing they were built to embody, that the gap between the sincere individual believer and the organized structure of belief is real and consequential, and that the people most faithful to the spirit of the thing are often the ones most in tension with its formal apparatus. The most theologically significant episode in the show's history is probably Homer the Heretic, the season 4 episode in which Homer decides to stop going to church and instead stays home on Sundays in a state of spontaneous contentment. He finds God, or something very like God, in the pleasure of staying in bed on a cold morning. He has a conversation with an actual God in a dream, and that conversation is written with unusual warmth and intelligence for a prime-time comedy. The God of Homer the Heretic is one of the most interesting depictions of the divine in American popular culture. He is not a disciplinarian. He is not vengeful. He engages Homer with something that feels like genuine curiosity and warmth. He validates Homer's search without condemning his methods. He speaks to him as an equal, which the institutional church never does. Several Christian media outlets criticize the episode for depicting God as a conversational partner for Homer Simpson, finding something irreverent in the familiar treatment. Others, including theologians who engaged with it more carefully, found it surprisingly sympathetic to genuine faith while being appropriately critical of institutional religion. The Mormon controversy is worth noting as a specific example of a group objecting with persistence and specificity. The LDS Church has historically been vigilant about its portrayal in popular media, and the show's references to Mormonism, while not particularly hostile by any reasonable standard, generated formal complaints through official channels on at least one occasion. Krusty the Clown and the show's treatment of Judaism represents a different and more extended engagement with religion than the Ned Flanders storyline. Krusty is Jewish. This is treated as a meaningful part of his character, rather than as a demographic detail or a source of ethnic comedy. The estrangement between Krusty and his rabbi father, his father's shame about Krusty's choice of career, Krusty's own complicated relationship with the faith he has neglected rather than rejected, these are treated with genuine emotional weight across multiple episodes. The reunion between Krusty and his father is one of the show's most genuinely moving pieces of family storytelling. The show's Jewish writing staff brought something real to those episodes that is not always present in how television depicts Jewish family dynamics. And then there is the darkest theological observation the show makes, which it makes quietly and consistently across many seasons. God talks to Homer. God has conversations with Homer. God has intervened in Homer's life. He has spoken to him directly, and he has never, in 36 seasons, spoken to Ned Flanders. The devout man who has dedicated his entire life to faith, who goes to church every Sunday, who prays without ceasing, who has structured every decision he makes around the call of the divine, gets silence. The man who barely thinks about God gets the direct line. Whether that is a commentary on grace, or on the arbitrary distribution of divine attention, or simply on the show's comic logic, is something the show allows you to decide for yourself, which is, perhaps, exactly the right theological posture for a cartoon. Section 9. The Political History of Springfield. George H.W. Bush did not have to make a speech about a cartoon. In January 1992, the sitting president of the United States told the National Religious Broadcasters Convention that American families needed to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. It was a line in a prepared speech. It was delivered to an audience that would appreciate it, and it became one of the most consequential television reviews in political history. Matt Groening's response was swift and precise. The Simpsons, the response noted, were a family doing their best to get by in tough economic times, and in that they might have more in common with the Waltons than the president had intended to suggest. The Waltons navigated the Great Depression. The Simpsons were navigating a recession. The parallel was there if you wanted to see it. Bush's line elevated the show by treating it as significant enough to attack from a presidential podium. Politicians do not respond to things that do not matter. The show benefited from the attention enormously. Bush lost his re-election bid later that year. The exchange encapsulates something essential about the show's political history. For 36 years, political figures have felt compelled to respond to The Simpsons, to claim it or condemn it, to use it or dismiss it. That compulsion is itself a testament to the show's cultural authority. The show's political content has always been more complicated than either its admirers or critics typically acknowledged. The show is not simply liberal. It is not simply conservative. It is a show that has consistently satirized institutional power of all kinds, found hypocrisy and corruption across the political spectrum, and resisted being claimed as propaganda for any single ideological position. Mr. Burns is the most explicit political statement the show makes consistently. Burns is the avatar of unchecked capital, the specific form of American wealth that feels entitled not just to comfort and power, but to immunity from accountability. He poisons the water supply and escapes consequences. He manipulates elections and escapes consequences. He commits crimes that would imprison lesser people and escapes consequences because his wealth insulates him from every mechanism of accountability the society has developed. Burns is a character portrait of plutocracy, and the show has drawn that portrait with consistency and venom across 36 years. That is a liberal critique. But the show also satirizes the political figures most commonly associated with challenging that kind of wealth. Mayor Quimby, the most prominent political figure in Springfield's recurring cast, is a barely disguised Kennedy parody who treats public office as a personal enrichment scheme with a side of civic pomposity. He is corrupt in ways that are played for comedy, but drawn with enough specificity to constitute a real critique of machine politics and the ways that ostensibly liberal urban political establishments perpetuate their own versions of the power structures they claim to oppose. The Trump prediction is the most discussed of the show's political anticipations, and it deserves more careful treatment than it usually receives. The episode Bart to the Future, which aired in 2000, depicted a future in which Trump had been a president and had left the country in financial ruin that fell to President Lisa Simpson to clean up. The episode was conceived as a joke about the logical extreme of celebrity culture and politics. Trump had been publicly discussing the possibility of running for president since the late 1980s. His candidacy was not an unforeseeable surprise to people paying close attention. The show made the joke that was available to be made. Writer Dan Greeny has said in retrospect that the Trump episode was meant as a warning, as an image of what the worst possible outcome of a certain cultural trajectory looked like. The fact that the warning was not heeded is not evidence of the writer's prophetic powers. It is evidence that the trajectory they identified in 2000 was real and was going to arrive regardless of whether a cartoon had pointed at it. The show's treatment of the Obama years is interesting precisely because of how different it was from the Bush years. The Bush administration generated significant satirical material. The Obama years generated far less venom from The Simpsons than from almost any other piece of sustained American political satire. And the reason for that is not simply that the Obama administration provided less material, it is that the show's creators seemed genuinely warm toward the president in a way that reduced their satirical distance from him. Obama appeared on the show in a context that was notably warmer and more affectionate than the typical Simpsons treatment of political figures. The show's left-leaning cultural inclinations were visible in a way that some critics found inconsistent with its claimed political even-handedness. If Burns is a merciless portrait of conservative economic ideology, what is the soft-focused treatment of a Democratic president? The honest answer is probably that satirical even-handedness is an aspiration almost impossible to fully achieve, and that the cultural and political positions of the people doing the satirizing inevitably inflect what they target and how hard they hit. The most significant political contribution The Simpsons has made to American culture is probably not any specific episode or political reference. It is the 36-year creation of a vocabulary for talking about American institutional failure in comedic terms. When people describe a Burns-like figure, or a Quimby-like politician, or a Homer-like failure of institutional oversight, they are drawing on a cultural vocabulary the show built over decades. That vocabulary has entered American political discourse at every level. Political columnists reference the show. Political speeches include Simpsons references. The show created a shared language for a country that often struggles to find shared languages for anything. That is an achievement that transcends any specific political position the show holds. Section 10. The Voice Actor Controversies. The history of voice acting in The Simpsons is the history of the show's relationship to representation. And that relationship is one of the most complicated and most consequential in the history of American animation. The controversies that have surrounded the voice cast span the entire arc of the show, from early questions about who should voice which characters, to the late period reckoning that changed the composition of the cast entirely, and generated one of the most significant public debates about race and representation in the history of American entertainment. The original voice cast was assembled before anyone knew the show would run for 3 decades. Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Hank Azaria, Harry Shearer, these 6 people became, over time, some of the most recognizable voices in American popular culture. They were hired for their comedic talent and vocal range, not with the explicit intention of creating a cast that would voice the entirety of Springfield for 36 years, but that is what happened. The question of who voices whom matters in ways that were not fully understood in 1989, because the cultural context for thinking about those questions was different then. The concerns that now feel central to any discussion of casting, specifically whether non-minority performers should voice minority characters, were not prominent public concerns in American entertainment when the show began. The show made casting choices that were entirely conventional by the standards of its time. Those choices became controversial as the standards changed around them. Hank Azaria is the center of this story. Azaria is a white Jewish actor of significant talent and range. He voiced multiple Springfield characters, including the character most associated with the show's representation controversies, Apu Nahasapi Mapatilong, the Indian-American convenience store owner who has been a recurring presence since the first season. Apu's characterization was built on a specific set of comedic choices. He speaks with a stereotypical Indian accent that Azaria performed in a voice he has described as inspired by a performance by Peter Sellers. He is hard-working to an absurd degree. He holds an advanced degree he has been unable to put to professional use. He is, by any analysis, a figure whose comedic function is substantially derived from his Indianness, in ways the show never fully interrogated. For years, Apu existed without significant public controversy. Indian-American viewers had a complicated relationship with the character, finding in him simultaneously a recognition of their own cultural visibility in American media and a discomfort with the specific terms of that visibility. The discomfort was real but largely private. In 2017, comedian Hari Kondabolu released a documentary called The Problem with Apu. It brought those private discomforts into public conversation with considerable force. Kondabolu interviewed a range of Indian-American comedians, actors, and cultural figures about their relationship to Apu, about the ways the character had shaped how their non-Indian classmates and colleagues related to them, about the specific texture of being represented in mainstream American culture through a figure whose primary function was to be funny in a way that required his foreignness. The documentary did not argue that Apu should be eliminated from the show. It argued that the character deserved to be taken seriously. That the show had a responsibility to think about what it was doing with the only prominent Indian-American character in American primetime animation, and that the specific comedic choices that had been made in constructing the character were worth examining rather than simply perpetuating. The show's initial response was defensive in a way many observers found deeply inadequate. In a season 29 episode, Lisa directly addresses the camera and says some things will be addressed later, or maybe not at all. That line was widely read as the show dismissing the critique rather than engaging with it. The defensiveness generated additional criticism and suggested that the show's creative leadership was more interested in defending its choices than in thinking seriously about them. The more substantive response came gradually. Azaria participated in conversations about the character and about representation more broadly. He did research and engaged with the community most directly affected by the characterization. And in 2020, he announced he would no longer voice Apu. He framed this not as capitulation to external pressure, but as a genuinely held conclusion about the responsibility that comes with a character like Apu and the specific history of how that character had been used. His public statement about the departure was unusually thoughtful for an actor relinquishing a character. He described a genuine process of learning. He spoke about having conversations with Indian Americans about their experiences with the character and coming to understand something about the specific harm of certain kinds of representation that he had not fully understood before. The broader changes that followed were also significant. The show made a public commitment to no longer having white voice actors voice non-white characters. Several other characters were recast. Carl Carlson, Homer's black coworker at the nuclear plant, had been voiced by Azaria since the beginning. He was recast with Alex Desart in 2020. The recasting decisions generated their own debates. Some critics argued the show was making the right decision, but that the right decision should have been made decades earlier. That the delay itself represented a failure of institutional conscience that belated corrections could not fully redress. Others argued that holding the present responsible for the standards of the past was unfair, that the show was responding appropriately to changed understanding and should be credited for doing so. There is a third position, less commonly articulated, worth considering. Even with a voice actor of Indian descent voicing Apu, would the character's comedic function be meaningfully different? The question of voice casting, while genuinely important, is one dimension of representation. The representation in the writing, in the characterization, in the specific choices about what a character is for, is another dimension entirely. Changing the voice does not automatically change those other dimensions. The voice acting controversies are ultimately controversies about what the show thinks its characters are for. When a character is drawn with genuine specificity and care, the question of who voices them is important but secondary to the question of who they are. When a character is drawn primarily as a demographic type, the voice becomes more fraught, because the voice is one of the few things about the character that is specific to a real person rather than to a stereotype. The Simpsons at its best understood this. Its best characters are people first and types second. The controversy about Apu is ultimately a controversy about a character in whom those proportions were reversed. What the controversy did was make visible a conversation about representation in animation that American culture had been having inadequately for decades. The show's eventual response to it, however belated and imperfect, represents a form of institutional accountability that is rarer in American entertainment than it should be. Section 11. The Merchandise Empire and What It Actually Cost. In 1990, you could buy a Bart Simpson beach towel, a Bart Simpson skateboard, a Bart Simpson cereal, a Bart Simpson doll, a Bart Simpson button, a Bart Simpson notebook, a Bart Simpson sleeping bag, and approximately 300 other Bart Simpson products. The merchandise phenomenon of the show's first years was one of the most concentrated commercial explosions in the history of licensed entertainment. Products appeared so fast in such volume through so many different licensing arrangements that quality control became essentially impossible. Bootleg merchandise appeared alongside official merchandise. The silhouette of Bart Simpson, that specific hairstyle and skateboard, became almost immediately one of the most reproduced images in the world. This should have been purely good news for everyone involved. It was an indication of cultural penetration that most shows never achieve. But the merchandising boom came with complications that the show would spend years negotiating. The first and most significant was the question of what Bart's omnipresent image was doing to the show's identity. The Bart Simpson who appeared on lunchboxes and the Bart Simpson who appeared on the actual show were related but not identical. The merchandised Bart was stripped of emotional complexity, reduced to pure attitude, pure surface, pure catchphrase delivery system. The Bart of the show was a child with a family and an inner life, and genuine vulnerabilities that the best episodes explored with real care. The danger of the merchandising phenomenon was that it created a public image of the show that emphasized exactly the qualities its creators were most ambivalent about celebrating. Bart's irreverence toward authority, his casual disrespect, his resistance to conventional childhood behavior, these were aspects of his character that the show treated with considerable nuance. The show understood that Bart's behavior had roots in his specific family situation, in his relationship with his father, in the specific environment of Springfield. The merchandise stripped out all of that context and sold the attitude in pure form. Matt Groening has spoken in interviews about his mixed feelings about the merchandising era. The financial success was obviously welcome. But watching his characters reduced to silhouettes on beach towels, watching the complexity of what he had created compressed into a brand, was not uniformly comfortable. The controversy around the merchandise extended beyond questions of quality and image. The products that appeared on the market in 1990 and 1991 reached audiences that the show itself did not reach. Children who were too young to watch the show, or who were prohibited from watching it by parents who had heard it was objectionable, encountered Bart Simpson through his merchandise instead. They absorbed the attitude without the context. They got the catchphrase without the character. The moral panic about Bart's influence on children was partly a panic about the merchandise rather than about the show itself, about the simplified and decontextualized version of the character that was available to everyone regardless of whether they had ever seen the actual source material. The cleanup took years. The show gradually tightened its licensing controls and developed more rigorous approval processes. But the cultural image that the early boom created proved difficult to fully revise. The Bart of the beach towels persisted in the public imagination even as the show continued developing the more complex Bart of the actual episodes. The early Simpsons merchandise represents the last gasp of a pre-internet commercial model in which the speed of cultural production outpaced the ability of intellectual property holders to control its deployment. The internet and the subsequent tightening of IP enforcement created a world in which that kind of uncontrolled explosion became much harder to replicate. The Simpsons merchandise boom was the product of a specific moment when mass cultural recognition arrived before the infrastructure for managing it was in place. That moment cannot be recovered. The Springfield theme park experience at Universal Studios is the most elaborate and expensive piece of Simpsons merchandising ever created. It is genuinely immersive, in ways the beach towel never was. It puts visitors inside Springfield with architecture and scale and detail that flat merchandise cannot approximate. And it is financially successful in ways that demonstrate the enduring commercial value of the brand decades after the original merchandise explosion. But the theme park also raises the question that all physical merchandising of narrative entertainment eventually raises. What is lost in the translation from story to space? Springfield on the show is a place defined by its logic, its relationships, its specific social dynamics. Springfield at Universal Studios is a place defined by its aesthetics, its food, its photo opportunities. The jokes that work in animation do not automatically work when rendered in fiberglass and signage. The world that exists to be watched does not automatically become a world that works to be walked through. The Simpsons merchandise empire across its 36-year history has been one of the most financially successful in the history of entertainment licensing. It has also been one of the most revealing. About the gap between commercial identity and creative identity. About the ways that mass recognition simplifies and reduces the objects of its attention. About the commercial logic that shapes how culture moves through the world and what of it survives the movement. Section 12. The Golden Age Debate. Every conversation about The Simpsons eventually arrives at the question of when the Golden Age ended. The question is posed as if the answer should be obvious, as if there is a clear, definitive line after which the show declined and before which it was great. In practice, the debate about the show's quality timeline is one of the most sustained and occasionally heated arguments in fan culture, precisely because the line is not clear and the answer is not obvious, and different people draw it in different places for reasons that reflect genuinely different values about what television comedy should do. The most commonly cited timeline in the fan community holds that the Golden Age runs roughly from seasons 3 through 8, season 1 being foundational but rough, season 2 being the show finding its voice, the Golden Era coinciding broadly with the Oakley and Weinstein tenure in seasons 7 and 8, which represent the creative peak by almost any critical measure. The argument for this timeline is supported by the critical consensus, by the episodes that appear most consistently on best-of lists, by the academic literature on the show, and by the sheer concentration of formally perfect episodes in those seasons. Cape Fear from Season 5 is one of the most technically brilliant pieces of comedy American television has ever produced. Homer versus Patty and Selma from Season 6 achieves a balance of comedy and emotional honesty that the show never quite equaled afterward. You Only Move Twice from Season 8 is the purest expression of the show's willingness to follow a premise to its most completely realized conclusion. Homer accidentally becomes the right-hand man of a charming supervillain, who provides him with genuine professional fulfillment for the first time in his life, and the episode does not treat this as a simple comedy premise. It treats it as a real story about what it means to finally feel capable at your work, even if your employer is secretly trying to take over the world. The arguments against this particular timeline are worth taking seriously. Some critics argue the Golden Age began earlier. That the show was producing extraordinary episodes by the end of the first season, and that the critical tendency to dismiss the early seasons as rough is a form of narrative convenience. The story of a show finding itself is more satisfying than the story of a show arriving largely formed. But several first and second season episodes stand alongside anything from the canonical golden era. Stark Raving Dad, which is the Michael Jackson episode, Bart Gets an F, where Bart studies desperately to avoid being held back a year and still fails the test, and the moment when he weeps is one of the most nakedly real things the show ever allowed itself. The Telltale Head. These are not rough drafts, they are achieved things. The Zombie Simpsons debate is the most extreme version of the quality timeline argument. The term was coined and later popularized in a book-length critique, and it describes the show's post-golden era as a kind of animated corpse, continuing to move and make sounds while lacking the essential qualities that made the original show worth watching. The zombie metaphor is polemical, but it captures a real feeling that many long-term fans have. The sense that the specific thing that made the show extraordinary has been absent for years, and that what remains, however competently produced, is a performance of a show rather than the show itself. The counter-argument is that the zombie metaphor applies an unreasonable standard. The original golden era of The Simpsons is not a reasonable baseline against which to evaluate 30 subsequent seasons. It was the product of specific circumstances and specific talent concentrations that could not be replicated. Measuring every later episode against the peak will always produce a verdict of failure, because the comparison is not between the later show and its own best possibilities, but between the later show and the greatest version of what the show ever was. That counterargument has real merit. It is also slightly beside the point. The question of whether the later seasons are good relative to their own best possibilities is different from the question of whether they are good relative to the show's peak. Both questions are valid and interesting. The first produces more charitable assessments of the later material. The second produces less charitable assessments. And the most honest answer is probably that the later seasons contain genuine achievements that would be celebrated if they appeared on a different show, alongside a larger volume of mediocre or forgettable material that benefits from the association with earlier work. The fan's relationship to the show's quality timeline is also a record of the fan's own life. The seasons you love most are usually the seasons you watched first. Later seasons are always measured against that internal standard, which is not just a standard of objective quality, but of personal association and emotional memory. This is not a defect in critical thinking. It is how cultural experience works. The things that reach you first reach you most deeply. The person who grew up watching the show in the 90s and the person who discovered it in the 2020s have access to the same episodes but have not had the same experience. The first person has a history with the show. The second person has an encounter with a completed archive. Both are legitimate ways of relating to the work. They produce different responses to the quality timeline debate. The Golden Age debate will continue as long as the show runs and will continue after the show ends. And it will continue to generate disagreement because the question it is actually asking, which is the question of what television comedy at its best can do, and how we measure the distance between the best and everything else, is a question without a final answer. What we can say is that the show at its peak produced something that belongs to the permanent record of what American comedy is capable of. The specific episodes from those golden seasons are as good as anything American television has produced in any genre. And the debate about where the Golden Age ends is ultimately a tribute to how genuinely extraordinary it was. You only argue that passionately about where something ends when you are trying to protect something that mattered that much. Section 13. What the predictions actually are. The Simpsons has been predicted to have predicted things for 36 years. By now, you have almost certainly seen the claim. The show depicted a Trump presidency in 2000. It showed a smartwatch in 1995. It anticipated the Disney-Fox merger, the Higgs boson, the coronavirus pandemic, the murder hornets, Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra. The list goes on. And every time a new apparent prediction comes true, the internet responds with the same mixture of amazement and suspicion. How are they doing this? Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on the show since its earliest seasons, has addressed the prediction phenomenon directly. His explanation is blunt. If you throw enough darts, you will get some bullseyes. That is his answer. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, references, and satirical observations about American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that much content over that long a period, some of it is going to align with future events through sheer statistical probability. Producer Bill Oakley put it even more plainly. There are very few cases where The Simpsons predicted something. It is mainly just coincidence because the episodes are so old that history repeats itself. Many of the supposed predictions have rather simple and mundane explanations. Many are based on trends that were already visible when the episodes were written. The writers did not predict Trump's presidency. They observed that Trump had been publicly flirting with running for office since the late 1980s and wrote a joke about the logical extreme of celebrity politics. They did not predict the Disney-Fox merger. They observed that media consolidation was an accelerating trend and wrote a gag about a mega-corporation swallowing its competitors. They did not predict smart watches. They observed that technology was getting smaller and more personal and imagined what a wrist-mounted computer might look like. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most educated in television. Multiple writers hold degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite institutions. Many have backgrounds in mathematics, science, and political theory. These are not people pulling random guesses out of thin air. They are highly intelligent, well-read observers of American culture who spend their careers studying trends, analyzing patterns, and extrapolating current trajectories to their absurd but logical conclusions. They are not predicting the future. They are reading the present more carefully than most people do, and then pushing it forward a few steps. But here is where it gets genuinely strange. Because while the debunking explains most of the predictions, it does not explain all of them. Some of the coincidences are so specific that statistical probability starts to feel inadequate. The Trump prediction did not just forecast that a celebrity might run for president. It named Trump specifically. The episode showed him descending an escalator in a sequence that visually mirrors the announcement he made in 2015. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just joke about exotic animals being dangerous, it depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers, which is almost exactly what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of their white tigers. These are not vague trend extrapolations, and this is where the meta theory comes in, the one that is more interesting than any conspiracy about time travel or prophetic writing staffs. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it, not through magic, through cultural influence. The Simpsons is one of the most deeply embedded pieces of American media in history. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand their own culture. When the show makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people say at parties and share online and think about when they see Trump on the news. The joke does not predict the future. The joke makes the future feel familiar. It primes the cultural imagination. It makes the idea of a Trump presidency feel less like a shocking impossibility and more like an inevitable punchline. When the punchline arrives, when reality catches up to the joke, it does not feel like prediction. It feels like recognition. We have seen this before. The Simpsons already did this. The show did not predict Disney buying Fox. The show made media consolidation feel inevitable by depicting it as obvious satire. When Disney actually bought Fox, the cultural response was not shock. It was, of course they did. The Simpsons already told us this would happen. Springfield does not reflect America. America has become Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and we stared into it so long that we started to resemble what we saw. The nuclear power plant, the corrupt billionaire, the incompetent government, the population too distracted to notice how badly they are being exploited, the endless cycle of catastrophe and reset. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was headed. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first, and here is the final piece. The Simpsons has also made thousands of jokes that did not come true. Jokes about jetpacks and moon colonies and political outcomes that went the other way. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody builds conspiracy theories around the predictions that failed. Confirmation bias only works in one direction. We remember the hits and forget the misses. And when you produce 800 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American culture, and then filter those observations through confirmation bias so that only the accurate ones get shared, you end up with a highlight reel that looks like prophecy. The predictions are not supernatural. They are the natural result of a brilliantly written show running for an impossibly long time, staffed by highly educated observers of American culture, producing more satirical content than any other show in television history, and then having that content filtered through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever created, which is the internet. The Simpsons wrote so many possible futures that some of them were bound to come true, and the ones that came true are the only ones anyone remembers. But try telling that to the internet the next time a Simpsons clip from 1,997 lines up perfectly with a headline from today. Section 14. The Mona Simpson Conspiracy. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson told Homer his mother had passed away when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned. He grew up believing he was a boy whose mother died and whose father was too cold and distant to fill the void she left behind. That belief shaped everything about Homer. His desperate need for love, his clinginess toward Marge, his terror of abandonment, his compulsive need to be liked by everyone around him, his willingness to endure humiliation, degradation, and abuse from his employer rather than risk losing the one stable thing in his life, which is his family. Homer Simpson's entire personality is a coping mechanism for maternal loss. And in Season 7, the show revealed that the loss was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November 1995. And it is widely considered one of the greatest episodes in the history of the series. Here is what happens. Homer fakes his own death to get out of working on a Saturday. He pushes a dummy off a cliff near the power plant, and the town believes he's dead. When Marge insists he go to the Hall of Records and correct the error, Homer discovers something that changes his life. According to municipal records, his mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him was not hers. It was the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been passing off a famous writer's headstone as his wife's burial site for Homer's entire life. Homer finds Mona at the cemetery visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She does not recognize him at first. He has changed. He has grown. He has become the person he became in her absence. But when Homer proves who he is, they have a reunion that is one of the most genuinely emotional scenes the show has ever produced. A grown man and his mother separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him the truth. She did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she had to. Because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who owned the power plant, the man Homer would grow up to work for without ever knowing the connection, had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. She was ordinary, living a quiet life in Springfield while the world outside was burning through the counterculture and the protests against Vietnam. And then something changed. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists. They targeted a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that settle for a moment. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant. He owned a germ warfare facility, a laboratory designed to produce biological weapons in Springfield, the same town where he had later built a nuclear reactor with 342 safety violations. Burns was manufacturing weaponized pathogens in the same community where Homer Simpson was growing up, where children were playing, where families were living their lives without any idea that the richest man in town was cooking up diseases in a lab down the road. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent stored inside. But Mona made one mistake. As the group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. That someone was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not hold her son or explain to him why she was leaving. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and disappeared into the night. For 27 years, Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead, and Homer spent the next 3 decades of his life believing he was unloved, believing he was the kind of son a mother would rather die than raise, believing that there was something fundamentally wrong with him that made people leave. Burns did not just identify Mona to the FBI, he pursued her actively for decades. He held a personal grudge against a woman who destroyed his weapons lab. When Mona finally comes back to Springfield in season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a cab window and calls the authorities. The FBI shows up at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Hoagland and he say OS. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. And Homer does not connect the dots. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not seem to fully process the connection between the billionaire who signs his checks and the billionaire who stole his mother. Homer's inability to make that connection is not played as a joke. It is played as tragedy. Because Homer Simpson is not capable of making connections like that. His brain does not work that way. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of cognitive erosion from living in Springfield's contaminated environment, Homer is too damaged to understand the architecture of his own suffering. And that is the conspiracy. Burns did not just ruin Mona's life. He engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally damaged, desperate for approval, incapable of challenging authority, terrified of abandonment, the perfect employee. A man who would work at a dangerous facility for decades without complaint, because the alternative, being alone, being unloved, being abandoned again, was worse than any job. Homer does not work at the power plant because he is too stupid to find better employment. Homer works at the power plant because Burns broke him as a child. And the broken version of Homer is exactly the kind of worker Burns needs. Compliant, obedient, grateful for any scrap of attention, incapable of resistance. The show later confirmed that Burns and Grandpa Simpson had struck a deal. Burns had committed a crime, and Grandpa discovered it. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would have a job at the plant no matter what, no matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how incompetent he was, no matter how many times he should have been fired. Homer was never permanently let go because the deal protected him. Homer's job security was not a cartoon convenience. It was a contractual obligation between his father and his mother's persecutor, brokered in silence, maintained in secret, and never explained to Homer because explaining it would mean explaining everything else. Homer's mother was a radical who fought against a billionaire's biological weapons program. That billionaire retaliated by destroying her family. Her husband covered up the truth and struck a deal with the enemy. Her son grew up believing he was worthless, became cognitively impaired through a combination of environmental poisoning and physical brain damage, and spent his entire adult life working for the man who took his mother away from him. 3 generations of Simpsons broken by one man's grudge, and Homer stands at the center of it. Too damaged to see the pattern, too dependent to break free. Strangling his son on the couch every evening in a house that runs on electricity generated by the same power plant that poisons his water and funds the empire of the man who stole his childhood. Burns did not just take Homer's mother. He took Homer's potential. The show proved this in the crayon episode. Homer without the crayon is brilliant, articulate, capable, aware, the man Homer could have been. The man he would have been if his mother had stayed, if Burns had not intervened, if the system had not conspired to keep him small and stupid and compliant. That man exists inside Homer's skull, trapped behind a crayon and a lifetime of radiation damage. Homer chose to put the crayon back because being smart in Springfield was unbearable. But the choice was rigged from the start. Homer was never meant to be smart in Springfield. Burns made sure of that when Homer was 6 years old and his mother vanished in the night. Mona Simpson died in a later season. Her death scene is one of the show's most quietly devastating moments. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. And he watches the mother he barely knew slip away for the last time. No joke, no cutaway gag. No reset. Just a man and his mother and the weight of 27 stolen years pressing down on both of them. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the jokes, underneath the gags, underneath 36 seasons of Homer falling down and getting back up, there is a story about a family that was systematically destroyed by one man's power and one town's inability to resist it. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the devil and buried the truth. Homer inherited the consequences and never fully understood why his life felt so heavy. And Burns won. Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules say Homer Simpson will work at the power plant until he dies. Because his grandfather made a deal. Because his mother made a choice. Because the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. And Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Section 15. The architecture of a Springfield joke. One of the things that is most difficult to explain about why the best Simpsons episodes feel different from everything else is the architecture of the jokes themselves. The specific way they are constructed, the specific relationship between setup and payoff, the specific timing of the verbal and visual elements, is a craft matter that does not always make it into discussions of the show's significance because craft is harder to talk about than theme or politics or cultural impact. But the craft is the foundation. The significance rests on the comedy, and the comedy rests on specific technical choices that the writers and directors and animators and voice actors made in every individual scene. The basic operating principle of Simpsons comedy at its peak is that every sequence of three things must end with the third thing being specifically, precisely wrong in a way that illuminates the first two rather than simply replacing them. This is the oldest structure in comedy, the rule of threes. But the show applied it with a specificity and a variety that made it feel perpetually fresh. You would expect X, and then expect Y, and then receive Z, where Z is not simply unexpected but specifically wrong in a way that completes a thought rather than canceling one. The monorail song is the perfect example. The first two things Lyle Landley sells to the town are set up. The monorail is the third thing. And the monorail is not just an absurd choice. It is the specific absurd choice that reveals something true about the kind of communal vanity and civic aspiration that small towns are susceptible to. The joke works as a joke and as a piece of social observation simultaneously. And because it works on both levels at once, it does something that purely one-dimensional comedy cannot do, which is that it gets funnier the more you think about it rather than less. You laugh at the joke and then you laugh again when you realize what the joke was actually about. The visual gag structure of the show is equally sophisticated and equally dependent on that principle of specific wrongness. A recurring visual motif in the early seasons involves the camera finding something in the background of a scene that has no narrative function but that is specifically, perfectly wrong in a way that illuminates the larger situation. A sign on a building that makes no sense given everything around it. A character in the background doing something unrelated to the main action that is precisely the wrong thing to be doing in that context. The visual world of Springfield in the Golden Era is full of these background details, these specifically wrong things that reward close viewing without being necessary for casual viewing. This is harder to do than it sounds. The visual wrongness has to be wrong in a way that feels inevitable rather than random. Random wrong is just chaos. The show was not chaotic, it was precise. Every background detail that worked was working because someone had made a specific decision about what kind of wrongness would illuminate what was happening in the foreground. That decision-making is craft. It is invisible craft because when it works perfectly, you do not notice the decision, you simply experience the laugh. But it is craft nonetheless. The voice acting structure of the show is the third element that deserves attention. The Golden Era Simpsons is unusual among animated shows in the degree to which the voice performances carry comedic information that is not in the script. Dan Castellaneta's Homer is not simply reading lines with appropriate timing. He is performing a specific psychology, creating moment-to-moment choices about where the emphasis falls and how the vocal quality shifts and what the hesitations and the emphases reveal about what Homer is actually experiencing rather than simply what he is saying. This is the difference between voice acting as narration and voice acting as performance, and it matters enormously to the show's comedy. A line that is simply read correctly is funny in proportion to how funny the line is. A line that is performed with genuine psychological specificity is funny in proportion to how funny the line is, and also in proportion to how much the performance illuminates the character and the situation and the specific gap between what the character says and what the character experiences. Castellaneta achieves this consistently across the early seasons in a way that is genuinely remarkable when you pay close attention to it. The specific quality of Homer's laughter, which varies in ways that reveal what kind of laughter it is, from genuine delight to nervous deflection to oblivious unconcern. The specific quality of Homer's confusion, which carries different textures depending on whether Homer is confused about information, or confused about a social situation, or confused about something in his own emotional life. These distinctions are present in the performance, and they give the comedy a dimension that the scripts alone could not provide. The same is true for the other main cast members. Each of them developed specific performance approaches to their characters that went beyond what the scripts required. Nancy Cartwright's Bart carries a vocal quality that shifts in ways that reveal his actual emotional state beneath the performed irreverence. Yeardley Smith's Lisa carries a specific quality of contained distress that makes the character's combination of intelligence and isolation feel real rather than conceptual. Hank Azaria built an entire ecosystem of secondary characters, each with its own specific vocal logic, its own specific comedic register, its own relationship to the world of Springfield. The architecture of the comedy, taken whole, is a collaborative achievement that required every one of its contributing elements to be operating at a high level simultaneously. Writing, direction, animation, voice performance, music, timing, all of these elements had to align in each individual scene to produce the specific quality of comedy that the Golden Era achieved. Any single element failing would have produced a different result. The result the show actually achieved required all of them working together in a way that cannot be willed into existence, but must be discovered through the specific chemistry of specific people, working with specific material at a specific moment. Understanding the architecture is part of understanding the loss when the architecture becomes less precise. The later seasons are not poorly made. They are competently made, often more technically accomplished in certain respects than the earlier seasons. But the specific alignment of elements that produce the comedy at its most complete is less consistently present. The writing may be good, and the voice work fine, and the music adequate, and the timing slightly off, and the slightly off timing means the joke lands at 80% rather than 100%. And 80% is still funny, but it is not what the show was. It cannot be, because what the show was required, the specific coincidence of the people and the moment, and the accumulated creative knowledge of a room that existed once and can never exist again in quite the same form. Comedy at the level The Simpsons achieved in its best years is a technical achievement as much as a creative one. The craft deserves to be named and honored alongside the ideas and the characters and the cultural significance. The jokes are the vehicle through which everything else arrives. And the specific quality of those jokes, the way they are built and timed and performed and animated and scored, is what made the vehicle worth riding for as long as the ride lasted. Section 16. The Springfield Cinematic Universe. The Simpsons movie arrived in July 2007. It was the show's 18th year. It made over $500 million worldwide against a production budget of approximately $75 million. It received generally positive reviews, and it generated its own set of controversies that illuminate aspects of the show's creative identity that the weekly episodes could not as easily reveal. The film had been in development for the better part of a decade before it actually appeared. The production schedule slipped repeatedly. Start dates were announced and then abandoned. Writers joined the project and then left. The creative challenge of expanding a 30-minute television format into a 90-minute film that would satisfy both casual audiences and devoted fans is genuinely enormous, and the show's creative staff took that challenge seriously enough that they were not willing to produce something merely adequate. The film needed to justify its own existence relative to the weekly series. It needed to do something the episodes could not do, not just be a longer episode. The solution they landed on was essentially to do what the weekly show had stopped being willing to do, which was to allow Homer's character to move. The film actually takes Homer through a genuine arc. He makes a genuine mistake. He faces genuine consequences. He makes a genuine change that the film treats as real, rather than as something to be undone by the next episode. The arc is not complex by the standards of dramatic cinema, but within the context of a show that had spent nearly 2 decades preserving Homer against meaningful change, it felt significant. It felt like the show remembering what it had originally been about. The plot centers on Homer's environmental negligence. He dumps a silo of pig waste into Springfield's lake in defiance of both common sense and his family's repeated warnings. This triggers an EPA response that results in Springfield being sealed under a glass dome. The family flees to Alaska. Homer has a crisis. Homer returns. Homer saves the day. The dome premise is one the show had been building toward implicitly for years. The Springfield nuclear power plant's long-running contamination of the town, the fish with 3 eyes, the cracked cooling towers, the 342 safety violations, all of it was always pointing toward a moment of federal reckoning. The film delivered that moment and used it as the vehicle for a genuinely satisfying story about the specific way Homer's obliviousness causes harm and the specific kind of courage required to acknowledge that and try to fix it. Albert Brooks voiced the film's antagonist, Russ Cargill, an EPA administrator who becomes the film's villain. Brooks brought to the role the same quality of specific comedic intelligence that his voice work always carries. Cargill is genuinely funny and genuinely menacing, which is a combination the show's regular antagonists sometimes struggle to maintain. The decision to introduce a new antagonist for the film, rather than using Mr. Burns, was a deliberate creative choice with both advantages and costs. The advantage was that the film could tell a complete story without requiring extensive prior knowledge of the show's mythology. The cost was that the film's antagonist had less resonance than Burns would have had for long-term fans, less accumulated history to draw on. The brief scene of Bart skateboarding nude past several Springfield locations generated the most immediate public commentary about content. The scene was deliberately included as a way of using the film's wider latitude relative to broadcast television, and it was provocative enough to generate discussion without being genuinely disturbing by any reasonable standard. It was the kind of provocation the show had always been comfortable with, testing the limits of what it could get away with as a kind of institutional assertion that it was not purely a children's property. The Simpsons movie's success immediately raised questions about sequels. Those questions have never been fully resolved. The producers have occasionally indicated that a sequel is being considered or developed. No sequel has appeared. The gap between the film's commercial success and the absence of a follow-up has itself become a minor ongoing controversy, with fans speculating about the reasons for the delay and the producers offering periodic vague reassurances. The most honest explanation for the absence of a sequel is probably the most straightforward one. The original film took nearly a decade to develop because the creative challenge was genuinely enormous. A sequel faces the same challenge, compounded by the additional problem of the show's history since the first film. A sequel would need to engage with what the show has been for the past 15 years, which includes the show's relationship to its own perceived decline and the changing cultural context in which The Simpsons now exists. Neither option, incorporating those years or sidestepping them, is easy. And the show's creative staff, to their credit, has always been unwilling to produce something that did not justify its own existence. The film's greatest achievement is probably that it exists at all. That a show which had been running for nearly 2 decades managed to produce a theatrical expansion that was genuinely cinematic rather than simply a longer episode. That held together structurally and emotionally in the way theatrical films need to hold together. That gave the characters who have lived in most viewers' imaginations for their entire lives a moment of visual scale that television could not provide. Seeing Springfield on a cinema screen, rendered in detail proportionate to its importance in American cultural life, was itself an experience worth having regardless of the specific quality of the story it told. Springfield had always been larger than what a television screen could contain. The film gave it room. Section 17. The minor characters who became major. One of the show's most remarkable achievements, and one that generated its own set of controversies about direction and focus and the proper limits of a show's creative ambition, is what happened to the minor characters of Springfield. When The Simpsons began, the population beyond the Simpson family was thin. There were a handful of recurring figures, most of them functional rather than fully realized. A neighbor, a bartender, a police chief, a principal, a teacher. They were drawn broadly, used as needed, and returned to their backgrounds when the main family required the foreground. What happened over the course of the first 5 seasons was something genuinely unusual in the history of animated television. The minor characters developed. They accumulated detail. They developed histories and psychologies and specific comedic registers that became distinct from each other and distinct from the main family's register. By season 5 or 6, Springfield's population was populated enough and differentiated enough that episodes built around minor characters could sustain an entire half hour without The Simpsons at the center. This was initially celebrated as a creative achievement. The show had built a world rather than simply a family sitcom. The depth of Springfield's population was evidence of the show's ambition. Mo Sislak went from a background figure to a fully realized character with his own mythology, his own romantic longings, his own specific tragic dimension. He is a man who has had so many things happen to him and has so consistently found himself on the wrong side of every one of them that his tragedy is not poignant in a sentimental way, but funny in a way that is its own kind of poignancy. The specific texture of Mo's failure, the way he is almost but never quite capable of the life he imagines for himself, is one of the show's most sustained pieces of characterization. Comic Book Guy became one of the most quoted characters in the show's history, a portrait of a specific kind of obsessive cultural consumer that resonated with fans in ways the show did not entirely anticipate. He was, in some respects, a portrait of the show's own most devoted audience, a mirror held up to the people most likely to be watching closely. The show's affection for him was always mixed with gentle mockery, and the people most likely to see themselves in him were the people most likely to be simultaneously delighted and slightly uncomfortable by the reflection. Sideshow Bob became the vehicle for the show's most sustained piece of literary parody, a recurring antagonist whose elaborate schemes always collapsed in ways that illuminated something about the gap between ambition and execution. Bob is brilliant in the way that brilliant people in cartoons are always brilliant, which is to say that his intelligence is genuine, and his capabilities are genuine, and he is defeated by something that has nothing to do with intelligence or capability. He is defeated by character, by the specific flaw at the center of his personality that cannot be overcome regardless of how meticulously he plans. He cannot resist an audience. He cannot resist the temptation to demonstrate the fullness of his own intellect at the expense of efficiency. The Fidelio aria moment, in which he allows himself to be stalled by Bart's request that he sing the entire score of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, is one of the show's most perfect character moments because the joke works entirely from who Bob is. He simply cannot say no to a performance, even when the performance kills him. The controversy around the minor characters emerges in the later seasons and is connected to a broader criticism about the show's use of Springfield's population as a resource to be mined rather than a community to be engaged with. The argument is that the later seasons began treating the minor characters as vehicles for specific comedic premises rather than as the specific people the early seasons had built them to be. An episode would require a specific kind of comic setup and would pull in whichever minor character could most efficiently deliver that setup, regardless of whether the characterization was consistent with what had been established. The general problem with recurring minor characters in a long-running show is that the qualities that make them distinctive are also the qualities most likely to calcify into stereotype if the writers are not careful. A character who is defined by one or two strong traits will eventually be reduced to those traits because that is the path of least creative resistance. Writers under deadline returning to a familiar minor character will reach for the established beats because the established beats work. But working is not the same as being interesting, and the accumulation of working but not interesting episodes eventually hollows out even the most brilliantly conceived original characterization. The Death of Maud Flanders is a case study in the complicated relationship between minor characters and the show's creative needs. Maud died in a season 11 episode, killed by a t-shirt cannon at a car race. Her death was widely reported to have been motivated not by creative necessity but by a salary dispute with the actress who voiced her. The actress, Maggie Roswell, had requested that Fox pay for her travel expenses so she could continue voicing the character while living in another state. The request was denied. Roswell departed. Maud died. The death generated significant criticism because it felt arbitrary in a way that major character deaths in the show do not usually feel. Mrs. Krabappel's death, after the real-world death of actress Marcia Wallace, was handled with genuine emotional care. The show took the time to acknowledge the loss within the fiction in ways that felt respectful of both the character and the performer. Bart's quiet sadness about losing the teacher, who had been his antagonist and his reluctant ally for so many years, was handled with the care the relationship deserved. Maud's death felt different. It felt like a commercial negotiation rather than a creative decision. The consequences for Ned's character, which the show explored with more seriousness in subsequent seasons, could not entirely retroactively justify the manner of the departure. The show did the work it should have done with Ned's grief, but it could not change what the manner of Maud's death revealed about the way commercial logic and creative logic interact in the production of a long-running television show. Springfield's characters are a collective achievement of the show's writing staff across 36 years. No single writer owns them. No single creative vision fully accounts for them. They are the accumulated product of thousands of creative decisions made by hundreds of people working in the same room over a very long time. That they remain as vivid and distinct as they do, that you can describe Moe or Sideshow Bob or Willie or Krusty and have the person you are describing immediately visible in your interlocutor's imagination, is one of the most significant creative accomplishments in the history of American animation. Section 18. The Music of Springfield. The Simpsons has a musical history that is almost entirely invisible to most of its viewers, which is remarkable when you consider how central music has been to the show's identity across its entire run. The score that Alf Clausen composed for the show, episodically and with extraordinary range, for the better part of 3 decades was a continuous creative achievement that received almost no public attention while it was happening, and then became the subject of a significant controversy when it ended. Alf Clausen joined the show in its 2nd season and remained its composer until 2017, when he was replaced by a new music team working in a different style. The change was made without public explanation. Clausen learned about his termination in a way that he subsequently described as abrupt and painful, finding out through a phone call that came without significant warning or context. He was in his mid-70s. He had spent more than 2 decades creating a body of musical work that was extraordinary in its breadth and its quality, even though most of the people who heard it every week had no idea who had written it. Clausen's scores for the show ranged from jazz to classical to country to Broadway to opera to rock to styles that he invented specifically for the particular comedic requirements of individual scenes. He conducted the orchestra for the recording sessions himself. He oversaw every element of the musical production. The show's specific sound, the specific way its music amplifies comedy and supports emotion and occasionally carries the joke entirely on its own, was substantially Clausen's creation. The episode that most frequently appears in discussions of his work at its peak is Last Exit to Springfield, the labor action episode from Season 4. The score for that episode includes a passage that parodies the specific musical language of dramatic action sequences, simultaneously delivering genuine dramatic tension and gentle comedy. The timing of the musical choices in that episode is almost perfect in a technical sense, the way music enters and exits scenes, providing a rhythmic structure that supports the comedy without overwhelming it. Clausen's compositions for the show's musical episodes were a separate achievement from his weekly scoring work. The show produced a number of episodes built around original songs, and several of those songs are now part of American cultural memory in ways that songs from an animated television show almost never achieve. The Monorail song, written by Conan O'Brien with music developed through the show's production process, is a piece of Americana. It is quoted in conversations that have nothing to do with The Simpsons. It appears at karaoke nights. It has been covered by professional musicians. It is an actual song that exists in the culture in a way that transcends its origin as a joke about a rundown New England town falling for a fast-talking con man. The Danny Elfman theme that opens every episode is itself one of the most instantly recognizable pieces of music in American popular culture. Elfman was a relatively young composer when he wrote it, primarily known for his work with Tim Burton. The Simpsons theme became the most widely heard piece of music he ever wrote, played 36 times a year, every year, for 3.5 decades. The specific energy of the theme, the way it combines manic velocity with genuine melodic warmth, established a tonal identity for the show that every subsequent episode had to honor. It says something specific about what the show is. Fast, energetic, warm underneath the chaos, committed to its own particular version of comedy in a way that is immediately recognizable. The controversy around Clausen's departure was substantial in the fan community and almost entirely invisible outside of it. The people who cared most about the musical dimension of the show felt that the change was disrespectful to someone who had given decades of extraordinary work to the production. The people responsible for the change have never fully explained their reasoning, which left the community to speculate about whether it was primarily a financial decision, a creative one, or some combination of the two. The new scoring approach that replaced Clausen's work has been described by critics who have paid attention to it as more generic, more consistent with the general sound of current American television production, and less specifically tailored to the show's individual comedic needs. This is probably inevitable to some degree. Clausen spent decades developing an intimate knowledge of the show's specific requirements. Any replacement team starting fresh would need time to develop comparable intimacy. The broader question the Clausen controversy raises is the question of invisible creative contributions, of the work that makes everything else possible, and that goes uncredited and unrecognized until it stops. Television music is this kind of work. So is the work of the animators who bring the character designs to life, the voice recording engineers who ensure the performances are captured with the clarity and nuance they deserve, the post-production teams who integrate all of the separate creative streams into a coherent final product. The show's creative achievements are usually attributed to the writers and the voice actors and the showrunners. Those attributions are not wrong, but they are incomplete. Clausen's work was invisible in the sense that audiences rarely thought consciously about the music while watching. That invisibility was a measure of his success. Music that calls attention to itself is music that has failed at its primary function, which is to support and amplify the other elements without being noticed. Clausen's music succeeded so completely at that function that it became part of the air of the show, indistinguishable from the show's general atmosphere. When it changed, the air changed. Not everyone noticed, but the people who noticed felt it in their bones. Section 918. The fan community and its discontents. The fan community that grew up around The Simpsons in the early 1990s was one of the first significant fan communities to organize itself primarily online. And the specific dynamics of that community, its relationships to the show's creators, and to other fans, have themselves been a source of ongoing controversy and analysis. The early Simpsons fan sites and news groups, particularly the Usenet group Alt TV, Simpsons, were among the most active early examples of what we now recognize as fan community culture. Before social media, before YouTube, before the podcast era that has produced hundreds of shows dedicated to analyzing and celebrating The Simpsons in obsessive detail, there were Usenet groups where people cataloged every episode, debated every creative decision, and developed a shared critical vocabulary for talking about the show that was more sophisticated than anything that appeared in mainstream media coverage. The level of detail in early online Simpsons discourse was remarkable even by current standards of fan engagement. Fans developed databases of quotes, cataloged obscure background details, tracked continuity errors across seasons, and built the accumulated institutional knowledge about the show that subsequent fans would draw on for decades. The Simpsons Archive, one of the earliest and most comprehensive fan sites, was a repository of episode guides, quote databases, and analytical essays that represented an extraordinary collective scholarly effort around what was, after all, a primetime cartoon. The relationship between the fan community and the show's creative staff has been complicated from early on. The writers of the show were aware of the fan communities and occasionally engaged with them, which was unusual for television writers of the era. The show incorporated references to fan discussions, acknowledged specific fan theories, and sometimes responded to fan criticisms in ways that demonstrated genuine awareness of the community's perspective. But the show also generated resentment in the fan community through the episodes and decisions that fans found most egregious, and that resentment took on particular intensity because of the specific qualities of the fan community. The people most deeply invested in the show were also the people with the most elaborate critical frameworks for evaluating it, and the combination of deep investment and sophisticated criticism produced responses to disappointing episodes that were sometimes more intense than the episodes warranted. The Zombie Simpsons discourse is partly a product of this dynamic. The sharpness of the language, the vehemence with which certain fans argued that the show had fundamentally betrayed itself, reflects the specific emotional investment of people who had built significant parts of their cultural lives around the show. Disappointment at that scale is proportionate to the investment, not to the objective quality of the disappointing object. The episode that directly addresses the Homer coma theory, which produced a fake deleted scene depicting Homer waking from a coma and revealing that everything since season 4 has been a dream, is the most elaborate direct engagement with a fan theory in the show's history. The scene was planted in fan communities as a leak, was discussed extensively before the show clarified that it was a deliberate hoax, and generated exactly the kind of conversation about the theory's validity that its construction was designed to generate. The conversation that followed illuminated something interesting about the relationship between the show and its fans. The fans who found the theory compelling did not simply accept the show's denial. They incorporated the denial into the theory itself, arguing that the show's willingness to construct such an elaborate fake addressed the theory rather than dismissing it. The show had, inadvertently or deliberately, given the theory more cultural traction through its hoax than the theory had been generating on its own. The online Simpsons community is currently distributed across dozens of platforms, from dedicated forums to subreddits to YouTube channels to podcasts to social media accounts. The Simpsons subreddit has millions of members. The content produced in that community spans the full range from obsessive academic analysis to extremely low-effort meme creation, which is probably a reasonable representation of the range of engagement in any large fan community. The relationship between the meme culture that has grown up around the show and the show's critical legacy is itself a source of ongoing discussion. Simpsons memes, which use screen caps from specific episodes to comment on situations and experiences in daily life, represent a form of cultural currency that is both a tribute to the show's depth of cultural penetration and a form of engagement that is very different from the engaged critical viewing that the show's best work rewards. The Marge sound, the Homer backing into the hedges, the Ralph Wiggum crying, the comic book guy saying worst episode ever. These images have circulated so widely and in such varied contexts that they have become part of the cultural vocabulary independently of the shows they came from. People who have never watched The Simpsons recognize these images. They have become communication tools that operate at a level of abstraction from their source material, functioning as symbols rather than as references to specific episodes. This abstraction is simultaneously a testament to the show's impact and a form of cultural compression that loses something essential. The Homer backing into hedges image is funny partly because of the specific situation in the episode it comes from, partly because of the accumulated history of Homer's relationship to difficult situations, partly because of the specific voice acting in the original scene. The meme retains the visual information and loses most of the context that makes the original funny. It is a useful communication tool. It is not the same thing as the episode. The show's capacity to sustain genuine critical engagement across 36 years is itself evidence of something. Most entertainment does not reward that much attention. Most entertainment is designed to be consumed and to produce pleasure in consumption, not to reward critical scrutiny with additional meaning. The Simpsons at its best rewards scrutiny in the way that great literature rewards scrutiny by having more in it than any single viewing reveals, by being built with enough craft and intelligence that returning to it produces discoveries rather than simply recognition. That the fan community recognized this early and built institutions to support and develop that recognition is part of the show's legacy. The community is part of the show's history now, intertwined with its production and its reception in ways that are genuinely novel for a television program. What happens in the fan community influences the show, and what happens in the show influences the fan community, and the relationship between them is ongoing and generative in ways that continue to shape what the show means. Section 20. The International Springfield. The Simpsons has been translated into more than 40 languages. It has aired in more than 100 countries. It has been adapted, dubbed, and subtitled for audiences whose cultural contexts are so different from the American suburban setting of the original that the translation required not just linguistic work but genuine cultural interpretation. The effort to find equivalents for specifically American references in cultures where those references simply do not exist. This global dimension of the show's history is one of its least discussed aspects, but it is one of its most revealing. The decisions made in translation, the choices about what to preserve and what to adapt and what to simply cut, are records of what different cultures find transferable and what they find incomprehensible from American comedy. And the show's success in so many different cultural contexts, its ability to generate genuine laughter and genuine recognition across such a wide range of audiences, is evidence of something in its fundamental structure that transcends the specific American setting it ostensibly depicts. The German dub is widely considered one of the most successful non-English versions of the show because the German language, with its specific capacity for compound words and its comic possibilities for compound absurdity, maps onto the show's comedy in unexpected ways. Some jokes that work adequately in English work better in German, not because the translation has improved them, but because the German linguistic structure provides a different kind of leverage for the punchline. The Brazilian controversy around the 2002 episode had an additional dimension that is worth noting here. The response in Brazil was partly a response to a specific piece of characterization that Brazilian viewers found inaccurate and offensive. But it was also partly a response to a broader pattern, the tendency of American popular entertainment to depict the rest of the world primarily as a backdrop for American experiences and American perspectives. The Simpsons episode set in Rio de Janeiro used Brazil as a setting for Homer's adventure rather than as a place with its own specific life and meaning. This is a common pattern in American television. The Simpsons made it unusually visible because of the show's cultural prominence. The show has been unusually attentive, compared to most American television, to the world outside the United States. Its satirical reach has extended more consistently beyond domestic targets than most American comedy does. But the Brazil controversy was a reminder that attention and understanding are not the same thing. That a show can be internationally aware without being internationally respectful in the specific ways that the people it depicts might most care about. The show's international popularity has also generated international controversies that American audiences rarely hear about. Specific episodes have been banned or restricted in various countries for reasons that reflect local sensitivities rather than universal standards. An episode dealing with gambling was restricted in Singapore. Episodes containing certain kinds of language or content were modified for various Middle Eastern markets. An episode containing a scene that was interpreted as disrespectful to a specific national symbol generated official complaints in one South American country. These international controversies are, in aggregate, evidence of the show's global reach and of the inevitability of cross-cultural misunderstanding in any creative work that tries to be broadly accessible. A show that reaches 100 countries will inevitably touch nerves in some of them. The specific nerves it has touched, the specific things that different cultures have found offensive or inappropriate in the show's content, are a kind of cultural map, a record of where different societies draw their lines and why. What the international history of the show ultimately suggests is that the show succeeded at something genuinely difficult. It created a place that feels real and specific and grounded in actual American geography and culture without being so culturally specific that it loses its meaning when transported elsewhere. The comedy of Homer's incompetence has clearly translated across cultural contexts that are very different from suburban American domesticity. The comedy of institutional failure, of bureaucratic dysfunction, of the gap between official claims and lived reality, has evidently been legible to audiences in contexts where the specific American institutions are unfamiliar. This suggests that what is universal about the show is not the specific cultural references, but the underlying structural observations about how human beings organize themselves and fail to organize themselves, about the gap between aspiration and achievement, about the specific ways that love and family both protect people and complicate them. These are not American observations. They are human observations that the show has consistently made with enough specificity and enough honesty to remain legible across cultural translation. The Springfield that exists in the imagination of a viewer in South Korea or Mexico or Germany is not identical to the Springfield that exists in the imagination of an American viewer. The specific local context inevitably inflects the meaning of what you watch, but something essential is preserved across the translation. Something about the specific family dynamics, the specific social textures, the specific comic logic of the show survives the journey across language and culture and arrives intact enough to generate the same basic response. That is not a trivial achievement. Most American entertainment does not survive that journey as completely as The Simpsons does. Section 21. The Animation Controversies. The animation of The Simpsons has its own history of controversy, its own trajectory from one kind of production to another, and its own set of arguments about what was lost and what was gained in the transitions. This is a dimension of the show's history that fans with a specifically technical orientation care about intensely, while most casual viewers have never thought about it at all. But the animation is the thing you actually see, and the specific visual character of the show changed meaningfully between its first season and its most recent, in ways that are both more and less than they appear. The earliest Simpsons episodes were produced using traditional cell animation, hand-drawn images on transparent acetate sheets that were photographed in sequence to create the illusion of movement. This is how animated television had been produced since the medium began. It is a labor-intensive process that requires the work of hundreds of individual animators, each responsible for a specific portion of the finished product. The results in the early Simpsons episodes are characteristically uneven because hand-drawn animation at a television production schedule does not permit the quality control that theatrical animation can achieve. Characters go slightly off-model. Colors shift between shots. Movement can be jerky in ways that more expensive production would have smoothed out. But the unevenness has a quality that is itself distinctive. The early episodes have a textural warmth that comes precisely from their imperfection. The slightly rough quality of the drawings, the specific way that hand-drawn lines carry the human touch of the people who made them, gives the visual world of Springfield a quality that later, more technically polished animation does not have. This is subjective, and many people watching the early episodes do not notice or care about the animation quality at all. But among the viewers who have paid careful attention to how the show looks, there is a persistent sense that something real was traded away in the transition to digital production. The show moved from cell animation to digital ink and paint methods in the mid-1990s and to fully computerized production techniques over the following decade. Each transition made the production process more efficient and the final product more technically consistent. Colors became more uniform. Backgrounds became more detailed and more stable. Character designs became more precisely controlled, less subject to the drift and variation that characterized the hand-drawn era. The show looks more professional than it did in 1989. The look also feels different in a way that is harder to quantify but real. The overseas production dimension of the animation controversy is one that deserves specific attention. Like essentially all American animated television, The Simpsons has its actual animation work produced primarily in South Korea, with various studios handling different aspects of the production pipeline at different points in the show's history. This is not a secret, but it is not prominently advertised either, and many viewers who think about American animation tend to underestimate the degree to which the physical production of American animated shows is the work of Korean animators rather than American ones. The specific studios that have handled Simpsons animation over the years have their own histories and their own relationships to the show's visual quality. When productions changed studios, viewers who paid close attention sometimes noticed differences in the visual character of the episodes. The changes were generally minor, the kind of thing that only someone already disposed to notice animation quality would catch. But they added to the ongoing conversation about how much of what any given episode looks like was under the direct creative control of the American production team, and how much reflected the specific skills and tendencies of the animation team in Seoul. The show's character designs have evolved considerably over its run. The early Simpsons characters are drawn slightly differently from the characters as they appear in recent seasons, in ways that go beyond simply the quality of the production technology. The proportion of Homer's face has changed. The size of his eyes relative to his head has shifted. The specific quality of the line work defining each character has become more controlled and less expressive. Whether these changes are improvements or losses depends on what you think animation is for and what relationship you have to the specific visual texture of the early show. The Simpsons is the longest-running primetime animated show in American television history, and part of what that longevity required was the ability to adapt its production processes to changing technological and economic realities. The cell animation era ended not because the show chose to end it, but because the industry moved on. The specific costs and logistics of the old production methods made continuing to use them economically unreasonable. The show adapted. The world it produces is technically accomplished in ways the early show was not. And the world it produces is different from the early show in ways that matter to people who loved it the most. Animation is a visual art form, and the visual character of a long-running animation is as much a part of its identity as its writing or its voice acting. The specific way Springfield looks, the specific quality of line and color and movement, is not simply a technical delivery mechanism for the jokes and the characters. It is itself a creative achievement, the product of thousands of artists working over 36 years, and its evolution reflects the larger history of American animation technology as much as it reflects any specific creative choices made by the show's producers. Section 22. The Legacy Question. What does a show leave behind? How do we measure the lasting contribution of something that was on television for 36 years, that reached several hundred million people across 100 countries, that generated more academic writing than any animated show in history? These are not questions with clean answers, but they are worth asking, because The Simpsons will eventually end, and when it does, the question of what it meant will move from the present tense to the past. The influence of The Simpsons on subsequent American animated comedy is so pervasive as to be almost impossible to fully map. South Park, Family Guy, Futurama, Bob's Burgers, Archer, Rick and Morty, and dozens of other shows that shaped American comedy culture in the years after The Simpsons established the genre all owe specific debts to what the show demonstrated was possible. They do not all owe the same debt, and the debts are not always acknowledged. But the specific proof of concept that The Simpsons provided, that animated comedy could sustain genuine emotional complexity and genuine satirical intelligence over a long period of time and find a mass audience for both, is the foundation on which every subsequent American adult animated show was built. The academic literature on the show is genuinely substantial. There are journals dedicated partly or entirely to analyzing The Simpsons. Multiple book-length studies have been published, examining the show from the perspectives of philosophy, political theory, cultural studies, theology, linguistics, and media criticism. The Simpsons and Philosophy, a collection of essays applying philosophical frameworks to the show's content, was a significant commercial success in academic publishing and demonstrated that there was a genuine audience for serious critical engagement with the show's intellectual content. This body of academic work is itself a measure of something. Television shows do not typically generate serious academic analysis unless they contain something worth analyzing seriously. The analysis the show generated was not simply the product of academics looking for accessible content to write about. It was the product of the show genuinely rewarding the kind of careful attention that academic analysis requires. The arguments the show makes about American culture, about institutional failure, about the nature of comedy, about the relationship between intelligence and happiness, are sophisticated enough arguments to sustain genuine scholarly engagement. The show's contribution to the English language is another measure of its impact that is easy to overlook because the contributions have already been fully absorbed. Homer's D.O. is in the Oxford English Dictionary. It was entered in 2001, 12 years after the show debuted, having been in daily use by millions of English speakers for most of that time. The word that the dictionary used to enter it was an interjection, which is the same category as ah and oh, which gives you some sense of how completely it had been naturalized into the actual fabric of spoken English. But dough is only the most famous example. The show gave American English dozens of words and phrases that are now used without any necessary connection to the show. May, as an expression of indifference, was popularized, if not invented, by the show. Cromulent was a word the writers invented for an episode, and that has since moved into genuine usage among people who read and write carefully. The phrase cheese-eating surrender monkeys, coined in an episode in the 90s as part of a parody of anti-French sentiment, found its way into actual political journalism and newspaper columns in the early 2000s. This kind of linguistic contribution is rare. Television shows occasionally generate catchphrases that circulate for a few years and then date. The Simpsons generated actual additions to the language, words, and phrases that filled genuine gaps in English vocabulary, and that continue to be used by people who have never seen the show and would not recognize their origins. That is not a promotional achievement. That is a linguistic one, and it reflects the specific quality of the show's writing at its peak, which was writing that consistently found the precisely right formulation for experiences and attitudes that had previously lacked precise names. The show will eventually end. Matt Groening has indicated that he would prefer to see it go out on its own terms rather than be canceled, and the production infrastructure that has kept it alive will eventually reach the limit of what commercial and contractual considerations can sustain. When it ends, it will have been on the air for an extraordinary span of American history. It will have run from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the present day. It will have provided continuous commentary on American life through the Gulf War and the Oklahoma City bombing and September 11, and the Iraq War, and the financial crisis, and the Obama and Trump eras, and the pandemic. It will have done this as a cartoon about a nuclear family in an unnamed American town, which is the most American thing about it. What it will leave behind, beyond the merchandise and the theme parks and the academic literature and the words in the dictionary, is the specific vision of American life that it developed and sustained across its entire run. A vision of a country that is simultaneously ridiculous and lovable, corrupt and resilient, failing and still somehow keeping the lights on. A vision of family as a space where love and dysfunction exist not in competition, but in constant negotiation. A vision of comedy as a vehicle not just for laughter but for truth, for the specific truths that are easiest to approach sideways, through the medium of a yellow cartoon family in a fake town with a nuclear power plant and a three-eyed fish and a bartender who always answers the phone. That vision will outlast the show. It already has. Springfield exists in the cultural imagination in a way that will persist even after the last episode airs and the last season ends and the archive is complete. The show gave the culture a way of seeing itself that the culture needed. That is the legacy. It is not small. Section 23. The show that would not die. Every few years, someone asks when The Simpsons will end. The question has been asked since around season 12, when the first sustained arguments that the show had run its course began appearing. It was asked more urgently after season 15, and again after season 20, and again after each subsequent milestone. The show has now run long enough that the people who started asking the question when they were 20 years old are now in their 40s, and the question is still being asked, and the show is still being made. The persistence of the show in the face of so many predictions of its imminent demise is itself a story worth examining. The show should not still exist. By almost every conventional measure of creative sustainability, it should have ended a decade ago. The original writer's room that produced its greatest work has long since dispersed. The cultural moment that made it feel essential has been replaced by other cultural moments. The critical consensus that once positioned it as the most important show on television has shifted to acknowledge its decline, and yet it continues. It continues because of Fox's commercial interests, which are real and significant. The show is still profitable. It still generates ratings that are respectable, if no longer extraordinary. It still functions as a reliable revenue stream from licensing, syndication, and streaming, which are the real sources of the show's financial significance. Fox has no incentive to end it. It continues because the cast and crew have built their professional identities around it. The main cast members have been voicing these characters for most of their adult lives. The show is not just a job for them. It is a central fact of their professional existence. A thing they have been doing for so long that its continuation feels natural, and its ending would feel like a genuine loss. It continues because Matt Groening, despite his often discussed ambivalence about the show's later seasons, remains committed to the idea that the show should end on its own terms rather than be canceled. Ending a show voluntarily, deciding to conclude rather than being concluded, is a creative dignity that Groening has cited as important to him. And it continues because endings are hard. The specific logistical and emotional challenges of ending something this large, this institutionalized, this commercially entangled, are genuinely enormous. Every year that passes without an ending makes the eventual ending both more necessary and more complicated. The longer the show runs, the more weight the finale carries. The more it is expected to account for and resolve. The higher the bar rises for what it would take to end the show in a way that honors its history. What would a good ending look like? This is a question the fan community has debated for years, and the answers tend to reflect the values of the people proposing them more than any objective standard. Some fans want to return to the emotional register of the early seasons, an ending that honors the show's best qualities by demonstrating that they are still accessible. Some want a formal acknowledgement of the show's history, a finale that references the full span of the series and treats its longevity as something worth commemorating. Some simply want it to stop, for the franchise to finally achieve the closure that would free it from the obligation to continue. Whatever the ending looks like, it will be a significant cultural event. The end of The Simpsons will be front-page news in a way that very few television conclusions are. It will generate retrospectives and analyses and reassessments. It will prompt people who have not watched in years to look back at what the show was and what it became. It will produce the kind of cultural conversation about a television show's place in history that most shows never generate at all. The show deserves that conversation. For all of its failures and limitations and the controversies we have covered tonight, the show has earned the right to a serious reckoning with its meaning, to an honest accounting of what it contributed and what it cost, to recognition of the specific ways in which it changed American culture and the specific ways in which American culture changed it. Springfield will still be there when the show ends, in the imagination and in the memory and in the archive. The family on the couch, Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, the power plant in the background, always leaking something, the town around them, always on the verge of some new crisis, the sky above them, reliably yellow. That image will outlast everything. The controversies and the merchandise and the predictions and the decline. The image of a family in a living room in a town that is every town will outlast all of it, because that image is true. It is true in the way that the most durable things in culture are true, which is the way that recognizes something real in human experience and holds it up to the light so that people can see themselves in it. The Simpsons held that image for 36 years. That is the show's final answer to every controversy, every criticism, every argument about when it peaked and what it became and whether it should have stopped years ago. It held the image. It kept Springfield alive. It kept the family on the couch. That is enough, more than enough. Section 24. The Springfield Economy. One of the most sustained and unacknowledged pieces of social commentary in the show's history is the depiction of Springfield's economy. The town's economic life is rendered in enough detail, across enough episodes, that it functions as a portrait of a specific kind of American economic reality that television rarely engages with directly. And the controversies that have occasionally touched on the show's economic content, the arguments about what the show says about class and work and money in America, are worth examining because they get at something central to what the show is actually about. Springfield's economy runs on the nuclear power plant. This is the foundational economic fact of the show's world. Burns owns the plant. The plant employs a significant portion of Springfield's adult male workforce. The town's prosperity, such as it is, depends on the plant's continued operation. And the plant is an environmental disaster, leaking radiation into the water supply, producing mutations in local wildlife, generating safety violations at a rate that would shut down any real facility in any real regulatory environment. The show presents this arrangement with a particular kind of dark comedy. The plant is obviously dangerous. Everyone knows it is dangerous. The fish with 3 eyes are evidence that the water is contaminated. The employees who work there know they are being exposed to radiation. The town that depends on the plant for its economic survival has a collective interest in not knowing too much about what the plant is doing. And so, Springfield sustains itself by performing a specific kind of organized ignorance, a communal agreement not to ask the questions that would require uncomfortable answers. This is not an abstract satirical observation. It is a description of how many American communities actually relate to the industries they depend on. The coal towns that did not ask too many questions about mine safety. The manufacturing communities that accepted levels of industrial pollution as the price of employment. The agricultural towns that looked the other way when the water started testing positive for things water should not test positive for. Springfield is a portrait of the specific American tendency to trade long-term collective health for short-term economic stability, rendered as comedy so that it does not require being thought about too directly. Homer's salary is another piece of the economic portrait worth examining. Homer earns enough to maintain a house, support a family of 5, own a car, and occasionally take vacations. This was not implausible for an American manufacturing or industrial worker in the early 1990s when the show began. It is considerably less plausible now, which is why the show's economics have drifted into a kind of temporal fog similar to the geographic fog surrounding Springfield's location. If the show had to engage with the actual economics of supporting a family of 5 on a single nuclear plant worker's salary in the contemporary United States, it would not be a comedy. The show has always been somewhat evasive about the specific numbers. Homer's salary has been mentioned on a handful of occasions, and the numbers mentioned have been inconsistent with each other and inconsistent with what the family's lifestyle implies. This is not a continuity error that demands correction. It is a deliberate ambiguity similar to the geographic ambiguity. The show needs Homer to be economically comfortable enough that his problems are not primarily problems of scarcity, while also being economically constrained enough that the power plant job feels necessary rather than optional. The show achieves this by simply not being specific. The class dynamic between Homer and Burns is the economic commentary the show has made most consistently and most vividly. Burns is unfathomably wealthy in ways the show does not attempt to rationalize. His money insulates him from accountability, from consequence, from the social obligations that bind everyone else in Springfield. He does not follow the same rules because the rules were never designed to apply to people with his resources. And Homer works for him, has always worked for him, will presumably always work for him, in a relationship that the show presents as not quite feudal but uncomfortably adjacent to it. The labor action episode from Season 4, Last Exit to Springfield, is the show's most direct engagement with the economics of work. Homer accidentally becomes the union representative and leads a strike against the power plant's removal of dental benefits. The episode is a compressed history of the American labor movement, rendered in absurdist miniature. The specific ways in which management uses economic pressure and social manipulation to resist worker organizing are depicted with accuracy underneath the comedy. The episode takes the side of the workers clearly and unapologetically, and it is the show's clearest statement of its position on the relationship between capital and labor. That episode came out in 1993, when the American labor movement was already in a state of sustained decline from the peaks of the post-war period. In retrospect, the episode reads as both a tribute to the labor movement and an elegy for it, an acknowledgement that the specific working-class solidarity it depicts was already becoming rare in the actual economy the show was set against. Homer wins the strike. In the real America of 1993, workers were losing them. The show's economic observations have accumulated across 36 years into something that functions as an extended critique of a specific version of American capitalism, one in which the benefits of prosperity are captured by the very wealthy, while the risks and costs are distributed across the working and middle classes who depend on the industries those very wealthy people control. That critique is embedded in the show's structure rather than stated explicitly. It is the water the show swims in, but it is there, consistent and clear for anyone watching closely enough to see it. Section 25. Springfield After Dark. The Treehouse of Horror episodes occupy a specific and somewhat anomalous place in the show's history. They are the episodes most explicitly exempt from the show's usual rules. Characters die and stay dead for the duration of the episode. Physics and logic are suspended in ways that are too extreme even for the show's normally elastic approach to reality. The horror genre framework gives the writers license to do things that would be impossible in the regular show, and they have used that license across 35 annual Halloween specials to produce some of the most inventive and most disturbing material in the show's history. The controversies around the Treehouse of Horror episodes are different in character from the controversies around the regular episodes. The horror specials have generated complaints about content that is too frightening for children, about scenes that are too violent or too viscerally disturbing for a primetime animated show, and about the appropriateness of parody when the subjects being parodied are genuinely disturbing works of fiction. The early Treehouse of Horror episodes were also the subject of content complaints that led to specific parental warnings being added to the broadcasts. Fox began placing viewer discretion advisories before the Treehouse of Horror episodes, specifically after complaints about the levels of violence and horror content. This was somewhat ironic, given that the regular episodes had been generating complaints about their content since the very beginning, and the show's producers found the distinction between regular episode content and Halloween special content somewhat arbitrary. The best Treehouse of Horror episodes are among the show's most formally adventurous work. The specific opportunities opened by the horror genre framework allowed the writers to experiment with structure, tone, and premise in ways that the regular show's commitment to character continuity and narrative reset could not accommodate. The episodes that work as genuine horror, that generate actual unease rather than simply a horror aesthetic, are evidence of the show's capacity to operate in registers beyond comedy when the creative constraints are loosened. The question of how frightening the Treehouse of Horror episodes should be is one that the show has answered differently in different eras. The early specials had a genuine darkness to them, a willingness to let the horror section of the horror comedy equation carry real weight. The later specials tended toward parody that was closer to pure comedy, using horror conventions as material to be subverted rather than as a genuine creative register to be explored. This shift is consistent with the broader shift in the show's sensibility in its later years, toward comedy that is more comfortable with itself and less interested in using the safety of the comedic frame to approach genuinely uncomfortable material. The annual appearance of the specials on October evenings for 35 years is itself a cultural institution. There are adults who have watched every Treehouse of Horror special since childhood, who have a personal history with them that predates their ability to critically evaluate them. The specials are part of how a significant portion of American television viewers experience Halloween. They are woven into the cultural fabric of the holiday in a way that is completely disproportionate to what they are, which is 30-minute anthology horror comedies produced by an animated television show. That disproportionate cultural weight is a measure of how thoroughly the show embedded itself in American life during the years when it was at its most vital. Section 26. What Springfield Says About America. The Simpsons, taken as a whole across its 36-year run, has said something extended and complicated about America. Not a simple argument, not a clean thesis. Something more like a sustained portrait that contains contradictions and ambivalences and specific insights and specific blind spots, all of them accumulated through the production of nearly 800 individual episodes by hundreds of individual writers and animators and voice actors working across 3.5 decades of American history. The portrait is flattering in some respects and devastating in others, and the mix of the two is what makes it accurate. America is, among other things, a country of genuine aspiration and structural inequality, of communal generosity and institutional failure, of extraordinary creativity and spectacular waste. Springfield contains all of these. It is a town built on a contaminated water supply, run by a mayor who is openly corrupt, dominated economically by a man who feels no obligation to the community he exploits, populated by citizens who are simultaneously clever and gullible, kind and selfish, capable of genuine heroism and of spectacular pettiness. That portrait has been consistent in its essentials across the show's entire run, even as the quality of individual episodes varied and the show's satirical confidence fluctuated. The show has always known what Springfield is. It has not always had the energy or the inspiration to depict it with equal precision and equal care, but the underlying vision has been stable. The specific American anxieties that the show has engaged most consistently are the anxieties of the middle and working class in an economy that is not working as it was supposed to work. Homer Simpson is not poor. He is employed, housed, family supported. By the standards of global poverty, his situation is comfortable, but he is also a man who feels, with some accuracy, that the system he lives in was not designed for his benefit and does not particularly care about his welfare. The plant runs not because it is good for Homer, but because it is good for Burns. The town survives not because anyone in authority cares about its residents, but because it serves economic functions that authority finds useful. Homer's situation is comfortable in the sense of material sufficiency and precarious in the sense of meaning, dignity, and recognition. That combination, comfortable enough to survive, not comfortable enough to thrive, is the specific condition of a very large portion of the American population, and it was the condition of a larger and larger portion of the American population during the years the show was at its most culturally influential. The show debuted in the year the Cold War ended, and the long American working class decline was beginning to accelerate. It captured something about the texture of that decline, the specific ways in which ordinary American families were navigating an economy that was growing in aggregate while distributing its growth ever more unevenly in a way that more serious and prestigious forms of art and journalism largely failed to do. The show did this in the medium of a cartoon about a yellow family in a fake town. The fact that the most sustained and accurate portrait of the American working class in the era of economic deindustrialization was delivered as a primetime animated comedy is one of the stranger and more instructive facts about American culture in the late 20th century. It suggests something about where cultural honesty can and cannot live, about which artistic forms are free to tell the truth, and which are expected to perform more comfortable fictions. Prestige drama could depict working-class lives, but it tended to do so in terms of tragedy and individual pathology, of people whose circumstances produced suffering that the shows invited the audience to observe from a position of compassion and distance. The Simpsons did something different. It invited the audience to recognize, to see themselves or people they knew or the specific texture of a familiar kind of American life reflected back at them without the softening distance of tragedy. Homer is not tragic, he is recognizable. And that recognition is both funnier and more politically pointed than tragedy, because tragedy allows the audience to be sad for the subject, while recognition requires the audience to sit with the fact that they are the subject. The show understood this. Whether it understood it explicitly, whether its creators could have articulated this theory of its own significance, is less clear. Artists who make true things do not always know why the things they make are true. They know how to make them, which is different. The show's writers knew how to make Springfield recognizable. The reasons why it was recognizable, the specific economic and social conditions that gave the show's portrait its accuracy, were not always consciously theorized. They did not need to be. The truth was in the work. That is where truth in art usually lies. Section 27. Maggie. We have spent the whole night in Springfield and we have barely mentioned Maggie Simpson. This is appropriate. Maggie barely says anything. She is the silent one, the one who watches from her stroller, the one whose inner life is almost entirely inferred from what she does rather than from what she says. She shoots Mr. Burns. She plays the xylophone. She communicates in a visual language of sucking pacifiers and wide eyes, and the specific expressiveness of a baby who is paying far more attention than anyone around her gives her credit for. Maggie is the show's quiet thesis statement. She is the character who is always present and rarely centered, the one who witnesses everything without being asked to process it into language. In a show built around verbal comedy, around the specific way that words and timing generate laughter, Maggie exists as a reminder that language is not the only way to mean something. That presence, sustained attention, the willingness to watch and absorb without immediately converting experience into speech, is itself a kind of intelligence. The moments when Maggie is the center of an episode are among the show's most formally adventurous. A silent episode built around Maggie's relationship to a security system at her daycare has almost no dialogue and tells its entire story in images. The episode takes the risks that the main show's commitment to verbal comedy usually cannot afford. It demonstrates that the people who made this show could have made a very different kind of thing if they had wanted to, that the specific choices that define The Simpsons are genuine choices rather than limitations. The question of what Maggie will become, of who she will be when she finally grows up, is one the show has gestured toward in fantasy sequences and future episodes without committing to any single answer. She has been shown as a doctor, as an architect, as a musician, as various other versions of a person who has grown into competence and achievement. None of these future versions has become canonical. The show has preserved Maggie's potential by refusing to resolve it. This is possibly the kindest thing the show does. It holds open the possibility of becoming for the character who has not yet spoken. Everyone else in Springfield is already what they are. Homer is Homer. Marge is Marge, Bart is Bart, Lisa is Lisa. Only Maggie is still in the process of becoming, still at the beginning of a story that has not been written. And the show has protected that openness across 36 years by simply not committing to what Maggie becomes. There is something moving about that, if you let yourself notice it. A show about people trapped in a specific kind of American life has always contained, in its quietest corner, a character who has not yet been defined by that life, who is watching and absorbing, Whose pacifier-sucking silence is also the silence of a person whose story is still entirely ahead of her. And the show, for all its compromises and commercial accommodations and creative inconsistencies, has never betrayed that character, has never resolved the mystery of what Maggie Simpson will turn out to be. Maybe that is enough. To hold open one character's future, to leave one door unmapped and unspecified, to protect at least this one small possibility from the determining weight of 36 years of accumulated history, in a show full of people who have already become what they are going to be, Maggie has remained who she might become. That is not nothing. In Springfield, where Burns always wins and Homer always resets and the town always returns to what it was, the preservation of a single open future is an act of hope. Small, quiet, expressed in the language of a baby who watches everything and says almost nothing, but real. Springfield always has at least one thing left to be. Section 28, the couch. We come back to the couch. Every episode begins there, or nearly so. After the title sequence, after the skateboard, and the saxophone, and the car pulling into the garage, the family runs into the living room and lands on the couch. The specifics vary. Wildly, over the years, as the couch gag evolved from a simple sight joke into a canvas for an extraordinary range of animation styles and structural experiments. But the couch is always there. The couch is, in the grammar of the show, the home. The family always comes home to the couch. Whatever disperses them, whatever separates them, whatever adventures or disasters the episode places between them, the episode ends with the family reassembled. The couch receives them. The television is on. The room is the same room it has always been. This is the show's most fundamental structural commitment. The family comes home, not necessarily in a state of resolution, not necessarily having learned anything that will carry forward, not necessarily having improved, but home, together, on the couch, in the room that is their room. There have been 36 years of arguments about what this commitment means. Critics who find it conservative, who argue that the show's refusal to let its characters change is a failure of nerve, an unwillingness to follow the implications of its own observations to their logical ends. Critics who find it honest, who argue that most American working-class families do not change in the ways that dramatic arcs require, and that the show's depiction of the eternal present is more accurate than stories of growth and transformation would. B. Both positions capture something real. The show has been both cowardly and honest in its commitment to the couch. Cowardly because there are moments when the characters earn a change that the show will not give them. Honest because the forces that keep people in their situations are real forces, not mere failures of will, and the show depicts those forces with accuracy even when it refuses to let its characters overcome them. But there is a third reading of the couch that neither the critical nor the sympathetic argument quite captures. The reading that the couch is not a trap but a choice, that the family does not return to it because they cannot leave, but because they choose, again and again, to be with each other in this specific room in this specific town. That Homer's return to the power plant, and Marge's return to the kitchen, and Bart and Lisa's return to the school, and Maggie's return to her stroller are not failures of imagination but affirmations of commitment. To the family, to Springfield, to the specific life that has been built here. The couch does not represent defeat. It represents the thing the show has been arguing for across 36 years, which is that the ordinary domestic life is not a lesser version of a life but the genuine article. That the family on the couch in the middle of America is where the most important things happen. That the world does not primarily consist of extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. It consists of ordinary people doing ordinary things and trying to love each other despite all of the ways they fail at it. Homer will come home. The couch will receive him. The television will be on. Marge will be there, and Bart and Lisa and Maggie. The room will be the same room. And whatever happened in the episode will have happened. It will be part of the fabric of what Springfield is, even if tomorrow the reset restores the baseline. The reset is not the point. The reset is just the mechanism. The point is what happened between the first scene and the last one. The point is what the family did and felt and said in the space between the opening and the closing. The point is that they were together. They are always together. That is the show's final answer. To every controversy we covered tonight, to every argument about quality and representation and politics and craft and legacy, To every complaint and every tribute and every academic essay and every fan theory, the family comes home. That is The Simpsons. That is what it has been doing for 36 years. And that, in the end, is enough. Section 29. Springfield and Sleep. There is something fitting about watching The Simpsons at the end of the day. Something appropriate about letting Springfield be the last thing in your mind before sleep. Because Springfield is a place that exists at the edge of reality. It is too specific to be entirely invented and too impossible to be entirely real. It is the kind of place you can only visit in the specific state between waking and dreaming, when the ordinary has loosened its grip and the ridiculous has become plausible, and the animated family on the couch feels as real as the actual family in the next room. The controversies we spent tonight with are real controversies about a real cultural object with real consequences and a real history. They are worth knowing. They give you a richer relationship to the show, a more complicated and more honest sense of what it is and what it cost and what it gave. But they are also just stories. Episodes of a human institution doing what human institutions do, which is to produce something extraordinary and then struggle to maintain it and fail and succeed and fail again and keep going anyway. Burns and his power plant, Sam Simon and his credit, Alf Clausen and his music, Marge and her resets, Homer and his crayon. All of it is real, and all of it is, ultimately, a set of stories about people trying to make something that matters. The show mattered. It still does, in the ways that things with history always matter. It is part of the record of what American culture was during a specific and strange and important period of time. It told the truth about that period in ways that will outlast the period itself. And now, it is late where you are. Whatever time it is, whatever country you are in, whatever version of your day is drawing toward its close, the phone is down or almost down. The room is quiet or almost quiet. And somewhere in the back of your mind, yellow and familiar and a little bit absurd, Springfield is waiting. The plant is leaking. The fish have 3 eyes. The mayor is taking a bribe. Ned is praying. Lisa is protesting. Bart is planning something. Marge is holding everything together. And Homer is on the couch, watching television, falling asleep in the particular way that Homer falls asleep, which is completely, without reservation, without the slightest sense that he is doing anything other than exactly what he should be doing. Follow him there if you can. The couch is comfortable. The television is warm. Springfield is everywhere. Sleep well. Section 30. The final controversy. There is one controversy we have not talked about yet, and it is the most personal one. It is the controversy about what you feel when you watch the show now, knowing what you know about what it was and what it became, knowing all the context that we have spent tonight covering, knowing about the writers who left and the voices that changed and the characters who got simplified and the controversies that were handled well and the ones that were handled badly. Does knowing all of that make the show better or worse to watch? The honest answer is, it depends on the episode, and it depends on what you need from it. There are episodes from the golden era that bear any amount of knowledge about their context and emerge more impressive rather than less. You Only Move Twice is funnier when you understand the craft that went into constructing it. Homer the Heretic is more moving when you understand the theological conversation it was joining. Bart Sells His Soul is more beautiful when you understand that the episode was made by writers who had thought seriously about what the soul is. The knowledge adds rather than subtracts. There are episodes from the later seasons that suffer from context. When you know about the quality debates and the writers who left and the specific ways the show changed its approach to character, mediocre later episodes feel like evidence of a decline rather than simply like below-average television. The context imposes a weight they cannot always bear. And there are episodes, scattered throughout the run but maybe concentrated in the middle years of the show's history, that are something you can only access by setting the context aside. Episodes where the comedy is still present and working, but where the specific combination of elements that made the show extraordinary is slightly misaligned. These are the episodes that require you to meet them where they are rather than where the best episodes were. They are good. They are not great. And they are worth watching anyway, not as evidence for any argument about quality timelines, but as television that is doing something real even if it is not doing the thing that the show at its best did. The controversy about what The Simpsons means now, to people who grew up with it and to people who are discovering it for the first time, is not one that is going to be resolved tonight. It will be ongoing for as long as the show exists and for some time after. Different viewers will find different things in it. Different episodes will mean different things to different people at different points in their lives. The show is big enough to hold all of that. Springfield is large enough to contain all of those different Springfields that people carry inside them. The controversy about what the show means is part of what it means. The argument is part of the value. What Springfield gives you is not a fixed object with a single correct interpretation. It is a place you return to, and what you find there depends on what you bring. It has always been this way. It will always be this way. The show produced enough, across enough years, with enough genuine craft and genuine intelligence and genuine care to be available for whatever you need it to be. That is the final thing worth saying about The Simpsons. Not its specific achievements or its specific failures, not the controversies or the predictions or the merchandise or the diplomats or the lawsuits or the salary negotiations, but the simple fact that it gave you a place to go back to, a town that is every town, a family that is every family, a couch that is ready to receive you. Springfield is always open. The light is always on. You are welcome there. Section 31. Returning to Homer. We started with Homer, and it seems right to end there. Because Homer is the engine of everything. The show does not exist without Homer. Springfield does not cohere without the specific gravitational weight of Homer Simpson at its center. Homer is why people keep watching. Not Homer specifically, not most of the time, but the thing Homer represents, which is the possibility of a man who is genuinely limited, finding genuine love and genuine meaning in the specific life he happens to have. A man who fell short of everything he ever imagined for himself and found, in the falling short, something that mattered anyway. Not because he overcame his limitations, because the limitations turned out to be compatible with love. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most important things a story can tell. That the life you actually have, the one that fell out of your hands before you could shape it into the life you intended, is still worth having. That the people you ended up with, the ones you did not necessarily choose with clear eyes and full information, are the people worth being with. That the job you hate but keep showing up for, the town you complain about but stay in, the couch you fall asleep on night after night, these are not the consolation prizes of a life. They are the life. Homer Simpson is the man America needed a portrait of and could not quite bring itself to produce in any more respectable form. The blue-collar everyman, who is not heroic and not tragic and not on a journey toward redemption or enlightenment, the man who is just here, in his house, with his family, doing his inadequate best. The show drew him with enough specificity that the portrait became universal. Enough specific wrong details, the strangulation, the idiocy, the donuts, the obliviousness, that you cannot miss seeing the person. Enough universal right details. The love, the persistence, the way he lights up when Marge smiles at him, that you cannot miss recognizing the person either. Homer Simpson is an act of love toward a kind of American life that American culture rarely treats with love. The show drew him for 36 years. That drawing is an act of respect, however imperfect, for the people he represents. He deserves that respect. They all do. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie and Ned and Moe and Krusty and Burns and Skinner and all the rest of Springfield. They are our people. We made them. We let them be made. We keep returning to the couch with them. That is the controversy that underlies every other controversy we covered tonight. The controversy about why we love something that we can clearly see is not perfect. Why we defend it, argue about it, keep watching it, keep returning to the question of what it is and what it was and what it means. We love it because it loves us back, not in a sentimental way. In the way that honest portraiture is a kind of love. The way that being seen clearly, with all of your limitations acknowledged and held alongside your best qualities, is a kind of love. The Simpsons saw America clearly for 36 years. That is the show. That is the controversy. That is the whole thing. Go to sleep now. Springfield will still be there in the morning. It always is. Section 32. The Dreams of Springfield. Near the end of every good Simpsons episode, there is a moment of stillness. It comes after the comedy has peaked and before the reset restores the baseline. A moment when the show lets the thing it has been building breathe before putting it away. A pause in the noise. These moments are easy to miss. They are brief and they are quiet, and the show never draws attention to them. But they are there. In episode after episode from the seasons when the show was at its best, a single held shot, a piece of music that lingers a beat too long, a look between characters that says something the dialogue has not said and will not say. These moments are the show's truest moments. Truer than the jokes, truer than the satire, truer than any specific argument the show makes about American culture or institutional failure or the nature of the soul. They are the moments when the show stops performing and simply is. Homer stands outside on a winter evening, looking up at the stars, briefly aware of the enormity of what he does not understand. Marge sits at the kitchen table after everyone else has gone to bed, alone with the specific quiet of a house that is finally, for a moment, not requiring anything of her. Lisa plays her saxophone in her room, not practicing, not performing, just playing, the music going nowhere in particular, expressing nothing that could be expressed in any other way. Bart sits in his treehouse at dusk and watches the neighborhood go quiet. Springfield spread out below him, familiar and still. The treehouse is his alone. From up there, the town looks manageable. From up there, it almost looks like somewhere a person could be content. These are the dreams of Springfield. Not the episode plots, not the satire, not the comedy. The small moments when the characters exist outside of what the show needs them to do. When they are just people in a town, at the end of a day, with the evening settling around them, the show has always known that these moments are its real subject. The jokes and the controversies and the presidential speeches and the diplomatic incidents and the voice acting reckonings are all real. They are all part of what The Simpsons is. But they are not why the show has lasted. The show has lasted because somewhere in the middle of all of it, it kept finding these moments. These small, quiet pieces of ordinary human experience that need no explanation and no satire and no controversy. Just Homer looking at the stars. Just Marge at the kitchen table. Just Lisa playing. Just Bart in his treehouse watching the light go. These are the things the show was always doing, even when it was doing everything else. This is what it will have been when the archive is complete and the episodes are counted and the legacy is assessed. A long series of small, quiet moments embedded in a large, loud, controversial, commercially successful, academically analyzed, diplomatically complicated, culturally pervasive piece of American entertainment. The large, loud things are what the show is known for. The small, quiet things are what the show is. That is the distinction worth holding as you fall asleep tonight. The controversy and the craft and the history are real, but so is the stillness at the end. The moments when Springfield simply breathes. Let it breathe. Let the show breathe. Let yourself breathe. The night is quiet now. Springfield is settling. The power plant hums in the distance. The family is home. Everything is as it should be. Section 33. Last night in Springfield. The last things before sleep. Homer is in the hammock in the backyard, snoring at a volume that Marge can hear through the closed window. He fell asleep there again? He always falls asleep there in the summer. Marge will let him sleep for another hour before she goes out and calls his name twice, and he will start awake and look confused and then remember where he is and lumber inside, and by the time his head hits the pillow on his side of the bed, he will be asleep again. He is always asleep. Bart is in his room with a flashlight under the covers, reading something he is not supposed to be reading. He will be asleep within 20 minutes. The flashlight will still be on. Marge will check before she goes to sleep and turn it off, and pull the covers up to his chin the way she still does, and will probably always do until he finally tells her to stop. And even then, Lisa is at her desk, writing in her journal. She writes every night. She has been writing every night since she was old enough to hold a pen. Someday someone will read those journals and understand things about Springfield that no one has understood before. That is not tonight. Tonight she is just writing, because the writing is what allows the day to settle into something she can understand. She will close the journal and turn off the desk lamp and lie in the dark for a while before sleep. She always lies in the dark for a while. She is thinking. Lisa is always thinking. Maggie is asleep, has been asleep for hours. She sleeps the way only babies sleep, completely and without reservation, in the total physical surrender of someone who has not yet learned to resist what the night offers. She is dreaming something. What babies dream is one of the things that cannot be known. But she is dreaming. Her small chest rises and falls. Ned Flanders is on his knees beside his bed. He prays every night. He has prayed every night for as long as he can remember. He thanks God for the day, for the kids, for the neighbor who occasionally tries him and keeps him humble. He asks for guidance and patience and the wisdom to be the person he is trying to be. He does not know if God hears him. He keeps praying anyway. The faith is not in the certainty. The faith is in the practice. Ned kneels until his knees hurt, and then he gets into bed and is asleep within minutes. Mo closes the bar at 2. He wipes down the counter alone. He stacks the stools. He turns off the neon signs one by one, and for a moment the bar is just a dark room with the smell of beer and old wood, and in that moment it could be any bar in any town. He locks the door behind him. He walks home in the dark. He has walked home in the dark so many times that the route is automatic. He does not have to think about it. He just walks. Springfield is quiet at 2 in the morning. Mo has the streets to himself. He does not mind the quiet the way some people mind it. The quiet is honest. The quiet does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. Burns has been asleep since 9. He sleeps lightly, suspiciously, waking at small sounds and lying in the dark, convinced for a moment that someone is coming for him, that some accountability has finally arrived at his bedroom door. It never has. He falls back asleep. He dreams of acquisition. Springfield sleeps. You can sleep too. The controversies are real. The history is real. The craft and the failures and the achievements and the arguments, all of it is real. And the show is real. The best and the worst of it. The episodes that hold their value across decades, and the episodes that dissolve in memory as soon as they are over. But none of it needs you to be awake right now. Springfield is handling it. The way it always handles things, which is imperfectly, chaotically, with a combination of genuine stupidity and genuine love that somehow produces something that keeps going. The light on Evergreen Terrace is off. The town is quiet. Sleep? Section 34. The network relationship. The relationship between The Simpsons and Fox is one of the stranger partnerships in the history of American television, and the controversies that have emerged from it over the years illuminate something important about how creative work survives or fails to survive its passage through a commercial broadcasting system. Fox launched as a network in 1987, 2 years before The Simpsons debuted. It was a scrappy upstart competing against NBC, ABC, and CBS, 3 established networks with decades of audience loyalty behind them. Fox needed something that the established networks did not have, and what it found in The Simpsons was exactly that. A show that was genuinely different, a show that the other networks would not have bought and would not have known how to air. The early Fox relationship with the show was unusually hands-off by the standards of American network television. The show's producers have described a creative environment in which the network largely left them alone, in which the combination of high ratings and cultural prestige gave the show a degree of autonomy that was genuinely rare. This autonomy is widely credited as one of the conditions that made the golden era possible. The writers were not writing toward network standards of what an animated family show should be. They were writing toward their own standards, and the network was smart enough, or lucky enough, or simply distracted enough by its other problems to let them. As the network matured, and as the commercial stakes around the show grew, that relationship changed. The show became too valuable to leave entirely alone. Network executives became more involved in production decisions. Creative suggestions arrived that were not always aligned with the show's own creative instincts. The show's producers pushed back on these suggestions with varying success depending on the specific situation and the specific season. The most public dimension of the Fox relationship controversy emerged not from the entertainment division, but from the news division. Fox News was launched in 1996, 7 years after The Simpsons debuted. By the mid-2000s, Fox News had become one of the most culturally and politically influential television networks in America. And the same Rupert Murdoch who owned Fox News also owned the Fox Broadcasting Company that aired The Simpsons. The irony of this arrangement was not lost on anyone. The Simpsons was a show with a left-leaning satirical sensibility that had consistently skewered corporate power, media manipulation, and right-wing politics. It was airing on a network owned by the same parent company that was building the most prominent right-wing media operation in the country. The show had, across its run, directly satirized Fox News multiple times, depicting it as a propaganda operation with specific and pointed jokes about its content and its ownership. These jokes aired on Fox. The parent company that owned the channel being satirized was collecting revenue from the show doing the satirizing. This arrangement was acknowledged with some self-awareness by the show itself, which occasionally made the conflict of interest the explicit subject of the comedy. A disclaimer appearing on screen during one episode stated that the following program contained scenes of Fox News being criticized, followed by an acknowledgement that the opinions expressed were not those of Fox Broadcasting. The joke was real. The situation was real. And the show kept making the jokes, and Fox kept airing them, and Rupert Murdoch's company kept profiting from both. Whether this arrangement represents a sophisticated form of cultural co-optation, in which criticism is rendered harmless by being incorporated into the system it critiques, or whether it represents a genuinely unusual case of a commercial enterprise tolerating satire of itself for commercial reasons, is a question that does not have a clean answer. What it does demonstrate is something about the relationship between satire and the systems it inhabits. The Simpsons did not exist outside of Fox. It existed inside Fox, was produced by Fox, was aired by Fox, was promoted by Fox. Its satire of Fox and of Murdoch and of the commercial broadcasting system was produced within that system, subject to its pressures and constraints, sustained by its revenue streams. The satire was real, but it was not free. It operated within limits that the system set, and the system set those limits in ways that were sometimes invisible and sometimes quite visible. The show's ability to sustain genuine satirical intelligence within those constraints is one of its genuine achievements. It managed, for a significant portion of its run, to say true things about power within a structure controlled by power. That is harder than it sounds. Most of the time, when commercial entertainment claims to speak truth to power, the truth is partial and the power has been consulted about which truths are acceptable. The Simpsons pushed that arrangement about as far as it could be pushed. Whether it pushed it far enough is a judgment each viewer makes for themselves. Section 35. The Question of Ned. We have mentioned Ned Flanders several times tonight without giving him the full attention he deserves. Ned is the character the show has most consistently and most quietly worked against the grain of audience expectation, the character who requires the most recalibration in how you approach him, and the character who reveals the most about the show's actual values when you look at him carefully rather than accepting the surface reading. The surface reading of Ned is easy. He is the pious neighbor, the good Christian, the man whose relentless cheerfulness and boundless generosity exist primarily as a foil for Homer's selfishness and incompetence. He is better than Homer in every measurable way. He is funnier than Homer only when the show needs a specific kind of comedy from him, the comedy of extreme goodness deployed in ordinary situations. That reading is not wrong. It describes things that are genuinely true about how Ned functions in many episodes. But it misses the layer that makes Ned one of the show's most interesting and most disturbing creations. The episode where the show reveals that Ned's niceness is the product of childhood psychological conditioning is the key. Ned was an uncontrollable child whose beatnik parents took him to a psychiatrist who spent years systematically conditioning the aggression out of him. The niceness was installed. It was not chosen. Ned did not arrive at his goodness through a process of genuine spiritual formation. He was programmed to be good, and the programming holds. And when it slips, what appears underneath is something that frightens him more than it frightens anyone watching. This revelation changes everything about how you read Ned's patience. When he forgives Homer for the death of Maude, when he absorbs yet another imposition from his neighbor with a smile and a neighborino, he is not demonstrating spiritual strength. He is demonstrating the persistence of behavioral conditioning that was installed before he could consent to it. His patience is not a virtue he has chosen. It is a cage he was placed in. He maintains it not because it serves him, but because the alternative, feeling the rage that lives underneath the conditioning, is more than he knows how to bear. This reading does not make Ned a tragic figure in the way that Homer is sometimes a tragic figure. It makes him something stranger, a man who is almost entirely the product of an intervention he cannot remember and did not choose, living a life whose emotional texture was determined by a psychiatrist he saw as a small child, sustained by a faith that may itself be partly a function of the same conditioning that produced the niceness. If you were conditioned from childhood to suppress anger and to channel everything you feel toward positive expressions, a strongly structured religious faith would be exactly the kind of framework that would allow the conditioning to continue to function. The show never says this explicitly. It implies it in the specific way the show implies things it cannot say directly. It shows you Ned's conditioning. It shows you Ned's faith. It places them in proximity and lets you draw your own conclusion about the relationship between them. What is not ambiguous is the show's position on Ned's reward. He does everything right. He is kind and generous and patient and faithful and responsible. He raises his children with genuine care. He maintains his community with genuine engagement. He suffers genuinely and recovers with genuine grace. And the show does not reward him for any of it. Not in the way rewards work in narratives about virtue. God talks to Homer, not to Ned. The universe of the show, which does contain an actual God who can and does communicate with characters, simply does not reach out to the most devoted person in Springfield. This is either theologically interesting or theologically devastating depending on your framework, and the show's refusal to resolve which it is leaves it as a genuinely open wound in the show's moral landscape. Ned Flanders is the show's most honest statement about the relationship between goodness and reward. The statement is that there is no reliable relationship. That goodness is its own thing, worth pursuing or not pursuing on its own terms, but not a bargain with any force in the universe that promises proportionate returns. Homer falls down and gets back up, and the universe takes care of him through some combination of grace and luck and the specific resilience of a man who is too cognitively limited to stay defeated for long. Ned does everything right and loses his wife to a t-shirt cannon. That is not a cruel joke. That is an honest observation about how things go. The show makes it gently, without rubbing Ned's face in it, without using his suffering as a punchline. It presents it as the fact it is and lets Ned do what Ned does, which is absorb it and continue. Ned Flanders continues. That is his heroism, such as it is. Not the heroism of overcoming or transforming, but the heroism of persistence in the face of a universe that neither rewards nor punishes goodness, but simply keeps generating Mondays. He wakes up, he is kind. He goes to church, he comes home, he is kind again. He goes to sleep, he wakes up and does it again. There is something in that worth honoring, even if the show does not quite honor it in the way Ned deserves. He keeps going. In a town that does not change, he keeps trying to be good anyway. That is not nothing. In Springfield, it might be the most anyone can offer. Section 36. The Simpsons and Death. The show has a complicated relationship with mortality. For most of its run, death in Springfield was either a punchline or a reset, something that happened with comedic regularity to minor characters and was treated with the emotional weight appropriate to a cartoon. Hans Moleman died in various ways across decades of episodes and appeared again the following week without explanation. Characters were killed and restored with the same casual ease with which the show reset any other consequential event. But the show has also handled death with genuine seriousness in specific instances, and those instances stand out precisely because they are so different from the baseline. When Marcia Wallace, the voice of Mrs. Krabappel, died in 2013, the show chose not to recast the character. Edna Krabappel was retired. The show acknowledged her death within the fiction in ways that felt respectful and genuine. Bart's quiet grief over losing his teacher was handled with the kind of care that the show at its best has always been capable of, and that its more casual relationship with mortality does not always permit. The death of Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, is the show's most sustained engagement with mortality as genuine loss rather than comedy premise. The scene where Homer holds his mother's hand as she dies is one of the longest-held scenes of genuine feeling the show has ever produced. It does not cut away, it does not resolve the emotion into a joke. It stays with the dying woman and the son who barely knew her and the weight of everything that was not said and cannot now be said. It is one of the finest things the show ever did, and it was produced in a season that also contained some of the show's least distinguished work, which is itself a testament to the uneven distribution of inspiration across a long run. The show's most philosophically interesting engagement with death, though, is not any specific episode but the pattern. Springfield is a town where death is simultaneously cheap and eternal. Characters who die in regular episodes stay dead. Characters who die in Treehouse of Horror episodes may or may not stay dead depending on the needs of the episode. Minor characters die and return without acknowledgement. The rules are inconsistent in ways that are never explained. Under the various theories the show generates about itself, this inconsistency takes on different meanings. Under the radiation theory, The town's biology has been so altered that death itself functions differently for different residents. Under the coma theory, death in the dream world is the dreaming brain's way of retiring a character it no longer needs, and the returns are the brain reintroducing what it realizes it still requires. Under the collective denial theory, Springfield has simply agreed that certain deaths did not happen, that certain people are still around because remembering them as absent would require acknowledging something about the town's relationship with loss that the town is not equipped to handle. The show's actual answer is simpler than any of these. The show is a cartoon, and in cartoons, death is often reversible because the medium's relationship with mortality is different from live-action drama's relationship with it. Animation has always had a casual relationship with consequence, including the ultimate consequence. Cartoons die and return. That is part of what cartoons are. But the show used that casual relationship selectively and deliberately, and the selections are interesting. The deaths the show treated seriously, the deaths it refused to reverse or minimize or use as punchlines, are the deaths that involved real grief in the real world. Marcia Wallace's death informing Edna Krabappel's retirement. The treatment of Mona Simpson's death informed by the understanding that maternal loss is not a punchline. The show knew the difference between deaths that were material for comedy and deaths that required something else. It did not always make the distinction correctly, but it made it more often than its casual relationship with Molman's repeated demise might suggest. Death in Springfield is as inconsistent as everything else in Springfield. And that inconsistency, like all of the show's inconsistencies, is evidence of something. Of a show that is always negotiating between what comedy requires and what honesty requires, and finding different balances in different moments, and not always getting the balance right, and sometimes getting it exactly right in ways that stay with you long after the episode has ended. Section 37. The Long Goodbye. Every long-running show develops a relationship with its own ending. The anticipation of the conclusion, the awareness that something that has been ongoing will eventually stop, shapes how both the creators and the audience relate to the work in its later years. The Simpsons has been in this condition for a long time. Long enough that the end has become a fixture of the show's cultural discourse, a permanent background note in every conversation about what the show is and what it will have been. Matt Groening has spoken about wanting the show to end well. This is a genuinely unusual position for a showrunner to express publicly about a show that is still running. Most creators of long-running shows either decline to discuss endings or express the hope that the show will run as long as possible. Groening's articulated desire for a good ending reflects something about his relationship to the show's artistic identity, his awareness that the how of the ending matters to the show's legacy, not just the when. What would a good ending look like? The fan community has generated extensive speculation about this, and the speculation tends to cluster around a few different possibilities. Some fans want an ending that allows the characters to age, to finally progress through the temporal freeze that has preserved them at the same ages since 1989. An ending where Bart turns 11, where Lisa goes to college, where Maggie says her second word. An ending where time, which has been suspended for 36 years, finally resumes. Other fans want an ending that honors the show's structure rather than breaking it. An ending that is recognizable as a Simpsons episode that does what the show has always done, but that does it with the awareness that this is the last time. An ending that lands on the couch one more time with the full weight of everything that came before it behind it. Still, other fans want an ending that simply acknowledges the fact of ending, that steps out of the fiction long enough to say something honest about what the show was, and what it meant, and what it is giving up when it stops. What is certain is that any ending will be inadequate to the full weight of what it is ending. 36 years of accumulated history, of characters and relationships and jokes and controversies and creative achievements and failures cannot be contained in a finale episode. The ending can only gesture toward the fullness of what existed. It can honor it. It cannot capture it. The show does not have to end tonight. It will end eventually, and when it does, the reckoning will be genuine and large and full of the specific mixture of love and grief and critical assessment that attends the ending of anything that has been alive for as long as The Simpsons has been alive. Until then, it continues. The plant runs. The family sits on the couch. Homer comes home and Marge is there and the kids are around, and Maggie watches everything with those enormous eyes. And the week's adventure resolves into the baseline, and Springfield prepares for the next one. That continuation is itself a statement, not about quality, not about whether the show should still be running, but about persistence, about the specific American quality of showing up again next week, regardless of what happened last week. The show has been doing that for 36 years. That is the show's longest-running gag, its most sustained piece of social observation, its most genuinely American quality. It keeps going, like America. Messily, inconsistently, carrying its history forward whether it wants to or not, still finding things worth saying, still sitting down at the table again, still trying.